The boots were still wet. That was the first thing Thomas Ward noticed every morning. Not the cold, not the dark, not the sound of the creek running 50 feet away. The boots, wet from yesterday. Still wet at 4 in the morning, going back on his feet for another day, whether he liked it or not. He had been in California for 47 days. He sat on the edge of his bedroll in a canvas tent that smelled like 3 men and damp earth and wood smoke that never fully left anything it touched. He dressed in the dark because there was nothing in the tent worth seeing, and because his hands knew the order by now without his eyes having to help. Buns, shirt, boots. The boots last, because putting them on was the thing that started the day. And once the day started, it did not stop until Thomas decided it was over. He stepped outside into the 4 o'clock dark of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The camp was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they have only recently stopped being loud. The saloon tent had gone dark sometime after midnight. The gambling table had folded. Somewhere in the rows of canvas shelters, 200 men were sleeping or trying to, and the sounds they made in their sleep were not peaceful sounds. They were the sounds of men who had worked too hard and worried too much and were now unconscious more than resting. Thomas stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water he could not quite see in the dark. In his coat pocket was a small cloth bag, tied at the top. Inside, it was everything he had earned yesterday. About $1.40 worth of gold, dust and flake, weighed out at the end of the day against the scale he shared with 2 other men. $1.40 after 11 hours of standing in cold water with a pan and a back that no longer fully straightened. He needed $600 after 47 days. That number had barely moved. Back in Ohio, his wife Mary was sleeping in a house that belonged to the bank more than it belonged to his father. His son William, 4 months old, had never seen his father's face. Thomas had never seen his son's face either. He knew William from a letter. Brown hair. Mary had written, "Loud when he wants something. Looks like you around the eyes." Thomas had read that letter enough times to have it memorized in the order she wrote it. He stood in the dark and listened to the creek and thought about $600 and wet boots and a boy in Ohio who looked like him around the eyes. In the daylight, the gold rush looked like opportunity. At night, in the mining camps of 1849 California, it felt like something much older. Hunger, fear, loneliness, the sound of men trying not to admit they were afraid. This is what the nights were like. Picture the image you already know. A man standing in California sunlight. Punt and hunt. The Sierra Nevada rising gold and clean behind him. His eyes are clear. His back is straight. He is at the beginning of something. And the beginning looks good. This is the image that ran in newspapers from Boston to Cincinnati in 1848 and 1849. This is the image that filled ships and emptied towns and convinced somewhere around 90,000 people to drop what they were doing and head west. It was not a lie. Exactly. It was just the image taken before the 47th day. By day 47, Thomas Ward's hands had changed shape. The skin on his palms had hardened and split, and hardened again in a pattern determined by where the wooden handle of his pan pressed against his grip for 11 hours at a stretch. His lower back did not straighten completely anymore. It got close. close enough to walk and work and bend again. But there was a point in the extension where something stopped. Some new limit. His body had installed sometime around week 4 without asking his permission. He was 28 years old. The work of placer mining, which is what Thomas and most of the men in this camp were doing in the summer of 1849, was not complicated. You stood in a creek. You scooped gravel and sand from the creek bed into a pan. You swirled the pan in a particular motion that washed the lighter material over the edge, while the heavier material, including gold if there was any, settled to the bottom. Then you looked at what was left. Most of the time, what was left was just gravel. Sometimes, if the day was good, there was color. A few flakes of gold catching the light at the bottom of the pan. Smaller than you imagined when you were back in Ohio reading about this. Sometimes a small nugget, though nuggets were rarer than the stories suggested. On a very good day, a man might find enough to make the 11 hours feel like they had a point. Thomas had $1.40 to show for yesterday. That was, by his own accounting, over 47 days, a slightly above average result. Here is what that meant in real numbers. $600 was what Thomas needed to pay off the mortgage his father had taken against the family farm in Licking County, Ohio. $600 by winter, or the bank would move on the property. Thomas had done this arithmetic so many times that it lived in him like a second heartbeat, always running in the background, whether he was aware of it or not. At $1.40 a day, before expenses, it would take him 14 months to reach $600. 14 months was not before winter. 14 months was not even close to before winter. But that was the average. The average was not the point. The point, the thing that kept every man in every camp along the American River and the Feather River and the dozens of creeks and tributaries feeding them, was that the average was not the ceiling. The average was what happened on ordinary days. And somewhere, on some extraordinary day, a man put his pan into an unremarkable stretch of gravel and pulled up enough gold to change his entire calculation in an afternoon. It had happened. It kept happening. Not often. Not to most men. Not in the way the newspapers described. But often enough, and recently enough, that no one who heard about it could completely stop believing it might happen to them. This was the engine that ran the gold rush, and it ran on hope more than gold. Thomas understood this. He was not a foolish man, and he had not been foolish about this. Before he left Ohio, he had talked to 2 men who had come back from California, one with money and one without, and he had listened to both of them. He knew the odds were not in his favor. He came anyway, because the odds of saving his father's farm from Ohio were worse. The sun went down behind the Sierra Nevada at around 8 o'clock on a July evening in 1849. The light changed fast when it went, the gold color draining out of the hills, and the creek going dark faster than you expected. And then the stars came out in a sky that had no city light for 100 miles in any direction to compete with them. From the ridge above the camp, if you climbed up there in the last few minutes of twilight and looked down, the fires coming to life across the valley looked almost beautiful. Thomas knew this because he had climbed up there once. 3 weeks ago, on a day when he needed to see something other than the inside of his claim. It had looked beautiful from up there. From inside it, the fires were just the thing that held the dark back. Thomas picked up his pan and walked down to the creek for the morning shift. The water cold, before he even touched it. The way it was cold every morning. The way it would be cold tomorrow. Day 47 was over. Day 48 had started. Listen to a mining camp at dusk. Start with the creek. The creek is always there. Always the same sound. The one constant in an environment where almost nothing else stays constant. Under everything else, the creek runs, patient and indifferent, moving the same water it was moving before any of this started, and will keep moving after all of it is gone. Then the fires. The sound of fires starting is different from the sound of fires burning. Starting is a small, tentative sound, the snap of dry wood taking, the first crackle of something deciding to commit. By the time full dark arrives, there are 20 fires going in a camp of 200 men, and the sound of them together becomes something like breath. Then voices, English in several accents, because the men from Ohio do not sound like the men from Georgia, and neither of them sounds like the man from Massachusetts. Spanish, because a significant portion of every California camp in 1849 came from the Mexican state of Sonora. Experienced miners who knew this work before any American had heard of it. The occasional sound of a language Thomas could not identify, coming from one of the groups he had not yet spoken to. Then the specific sounds of the camp shutting down what it does in daylight and starting what it does at night. The scrape of tools being set aside, the thud of boots being pulled off outside tent flaps, the clatter of tin cups and tin plates at the makeshift cook areas, and underneath all of it, always, the creek. A mining camp in 1849 was not a town. This is the first and most important thing to understand about it. A town has permanence in its architecture, in its institution, in the intention of the people who built it to still be there next year. A mining camp had none of these things. Everything in it said the same thing in a different way. I am here for now. I will be somewhere else when now changes. The structures were canvas and rough timber, and whatever else was available. The streets, if you wanted to call them that, were paths worn by the passage of feet between one temporary structure and another, turning to mud when it rained, and to something like concrete when it dried. The organization of the camp, who was where and why, had been determined by who arrived first, and what patch of ground or stretch of creek they had staked before the next man arrived. A claim was marked with stakes, usually wooden, driven into the ground at the corners of whatever area a miner was working. Your name on a piece of cloth tied to the stake. That was the system. That was all of the system. What made it work, when it worked, was not law. Formal law in 1849 California was thin, distant, and unevenly applied. California was not yet a state, and would not become one until September of 1850. What made the camp function was the agreement of the men around you to respect what you had staked, because they expected the same respect from you. And because everyone understood that the alternative to this informal agreement was a situation where nobody's claim was safe and nobody could get any work done, a mining camp was not a town without rules. It was a place where rules were being written by men who already had something to lose. The rules were different in different camps. Some camps had formal miners' meetings. Regular gatherings where disputes were aired, and collective decisions made about how things would work. Some camps operated more loosely, on an understanding that held until it did not. The quality of these arrangements varied enormously, because they depended entirely on the character of the men involved. And the men involved had come from everywhere and been through different things and brought different assumptions about how people were supposed to treat each other. The camps also had names, and the names told you something. Hangtown, Murderer's Bar, Rough and Ready, Poker Flat, Whiskey Flat. These names were not chosen by cartographers or city planners. They were chosen by the men who lived in them, or given by men who passed through and described what they saw, and then repeated until they stuck. A town that names itself Hangtown is a town telling you something honest about its early days. The official name came later, after the territory became a state, and the state decided it needed more dignified place names. Placerville, California, was once Hangtown. The original name was more accurate. Thomas arrived at this camp in late May, with 11 other men from 3 Ohio counties who had traveled together as far as Sacramento before the group fractured, along the lines of different information about where the gold was. He had been here since, not because he had found enough gold to stay, but because he had not found enough gold to justify the cost and time of moving. His tent was 8 feet by 10 feet of canvas, shared with 2 other men, James Riordan from Muskingum County, and a man everyone called Dutch, who was actually from Pennsylvania, and whose real name Thomas had learned, and then somehow lost in the daily grind of the camp. The 3 of them had arrived here separately and had pooled their canvas, because 3 men in one tent was warmer and cheaper than 3 separate arrangements. They knew each other's names and general situations and almost nothing else about each other. This was not unusual. In a camp of 200 people, in a place where none of them had been 6 months ago, deep knowledge of the people around you was a luxury that the pace of daily life did not easily support. You knew what mattered practically. And what mattered practically was whether the man in the next claim was going to respect your stakes, and whether the men you shared your tent with were going to steal from you in the night. So far, on both counts, Thomas had been fortunate. He sat by the fire after supper and watched the camp organize itself for the evening in the way it always did. The same general pattern each night, with the same small variations. The cooking fires dying down, the movement toward the saloon tent, and the gambling operation at the far end of camp, the quieter movement of men toward their bedrolls, the ones who needed their sleep more than they needed company. In the morning, this would all reverse. Fires up before light, pan and shovel, the creek, always the creek. For now, it was evening, and the camp was doing what camps do when the work stops and the night starts, which has become something slightly different from what it is in daylight, something with its own rules and its own economy and its own kind of danger. Thomas put more wood on the fire. The night in a mining camp was a different country from the day. It was time to see what that country was made of. Thomas had a habit he had developed somewhere around the second week. Every morning, before the light was fully up, while the camp was still in that gray in-between state, where shapes existed but details did not, he would stand at the edge of his claim and look around at the men emerging from their tents. He told himself he was watching for anything that might affect his day. A dispute forming, a tool left somewhere it should not be, weather coming in from the west. But mostly, he was just looking, trying to understand where he had ended up. The newspapers back in Ohio had printed a particular picture of the California gold fields. The men in that picture were American in a specific way. The way that meant white, and from somewhere east of the Mississippi, and Protestant, and shaped by the same general set of assumptions about how the world worked and what a man was supposed to do in it. The men in that picture looked like Thomas. They looked like his neighbors. The camp Thomas actually lived in looked nothing like that picture. To his left most mornings, a group of men who had come up from the Mexican state of Sonora, 6 of them working adjacent claims, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from knowing what you are doing before you begin, not learning it as you go. They used a rocker, a wooden box that processed gravel faster than a pan when handled properly, swaying the material back and forth until the lighter sediment washed away and the heavier particles settled at the bottom. Thomas had watched them work for 2 weeks before he understood what they were doing differently. He had adjusted his own technique based on what he observed, and his daily yield had improved. He had never told anyone where the adjustment came from. To his right, 2 men from Chile who had come by ship around Cape Horn. 3 months of open ocean to get here. Thomas knew this because one of them, a compact man in his 30s named Arturo, spoke enough English to have told him so one evening at the fire, in the particular sentence structure of someone translating carefully from another language. 3 months on the water, Arturo had said, and then held up 3 fingers to make sure Thomas had understood the number. Thomas had nodded. He did not know what to say to 3 months on the water as the price of admission to this valley. So he had said nothing. And Arturo had seemed to understand that nothing was an acceptable response. Across the creek, a group of men Thomas could not place by language or appearance, working a stretch of ground that had been producing modest but consistent results for 3 weeks. Someone had said they were from Hawaii, sailors who had jumped ship when their vessel put into San Francisco Bay, and the captain could not compete with the rumor of gold for his crew's attention. In 1849, ships were arriving in San Francisco Bay and staying there, deserted by their crews, accumulating in the harbor like a wooden city that nobody lived in anymore. And then there were the Americans, the men who looked like the newspaper picture. They were the majority in most camps, or close to it, in this early period of the rush, but the majority in a camp of 200 is not the same as everyone. And the difference between the picture in the newspaper and the reality of the camp was large enough that every man who arrived from the eastern states had to make some adjustment to what he had expected to find. Some men made that adjustment without much difficulty. Others did not. And the ones who did not were the source of most of the trouble that camps produced. Because the trouble in mining camps almost always came from the gap between what someone thought they deserved and what the reality of the place was actually offering them. Near the cooking fire, each morning, Caleb Marsh, from Vermont. Thomas had met Caleb on the trail coming over the mountains, in one of those accidental companionships that forms when 2 people are moving at the same pace through the same difficult terrain and have nothing to lose by talking. Caleb had been a shipbuilder in Burlington before this. He was 31 years old, lean in the way of men, who were lean before they started losing trail weight. And he had a quality Thomas had noticed early and kept noticing, which was that he never complained. Not once in 7 weeks had Thomas heard Caleb Marsh complain about anything. At first Thomas had taken this for contentment, or for the particular stoicism of New England men, which was a real thing Thomas had encountered before. But as the weeks went on and the conditions remained what they were, Thomas began to revise his interpretation. A man who complains is a man who still believes that saying something about his situation might change it. A man who has stopped complaining has made a different calculation. Thomas was not sure which kind of man Caleb was. He watched him at the fire in the mornings and could not tell. There were also the men Thomas did not know what to make of, which was most of them. Mining camps in 1849 were among the most demographically unusual places in American history, though no one at the time would have used that language or perhaps even noticed it in those terms. What they noticed was more immediate. The man next to you might be from Georgia, or from Chile, or from the Mexican state of Sonora, or from a ship out of Honolulu. He might have a family he was trying to save, or a debt he was running from, or a genuine taste for adventure, or nothing left to lose. He might be planning to stay in California for the rest of his life, or to be back east by Christmas. The one thing everyone had in common was the thing no one talked about directly. They had all come too far to admit they were afraid. Fear in a mining camp was not the fear of specific dangers, though specific dangers existed. It was a more general fear, harder to name, and therefore harder to deal with. The fear that the numbers would not work out, the fear that the good claim was always somewhere else, the creek you had not tried yet, the drainage nobody had gotten to, the fear of being the man who came back with nothing after all of this, who had to walk back into the life he had left and explain why the calculation had not worked. That fear was present in every tent and at every fire and on every face, if you knew how to look for it. Men dealt with it in different ways. Some talked too much and too loudly about what they expected to find, as if the loudness of the expectation could make it more real. Some went quiet and stayed quiet. Some threw themselves into the work with a ferocity that was less about optimism than about the relief of physical effort. The way that exhaustion was preferable to the particular kind of thinking that happened when the body was still. Thomas dealt with it by keeping his ledger. Every night before he slept, he wrote the day's numbers in a small notebook he had brought from Ohio. Date, gold recovered, estimated value, running total toward $600. The act of writing it down was not exactly comforting, but it was clarifying. And clarifying was the closest Thomas could get to comforting in a place like this. He knew where he stood. He knew what he needed. He knew how far away it was. He did not know how he was going to close the gap, but knowing the size of the gap exactly was better than not knowing, because not knowing was what the fear lived in. And Thomas had decided, somewhere in the first 2 weeks, that he was going to give the fear as little room as possible. He watched Caleb Marsh drink his morning coffee in silence. Caleb looked at the creek, at the claims being set up around them, at the mountains beyond. He did not look like a man who had found what he came for. He did not look like a man who was ready to say so. The camp was not only divided by language, it was already dividing by something harder to see and easier to feel. A structure of advantage and disadvantage that had followed these men from the world they came from into the valley they had chosen, wearing different clothes but carrying the same weight. That would become clearer as the days went on. For now, in the gray light before the work started, It was just men with their coffee and their fear and the creek running through all of it, waiting for the sun to make the day official. Start with the beans, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor for anything larger. Just the beans themselves, in a pot that had been cleaned imperfectly and would be cleaned imperfectly again tonight, sitting over a fire that Thomas had built from wood he had carried from further away than last week, because the wood closer to camp had been burned already. Supper in a mining camp in 1849 was an exercise in nutrition, stripped of everything that made food something other than fuel. Beans were the foundation. They were cheap relative to other things. They traveled well. They kept. And they provided enough of what a working body needed to keep the working body working, which was the only standard being applied. Salt pork or bacon went into the beans when there was salt pork or bacon, which was most of the time, but not all of the time. Hardtack or bread so dense it was nearly hardtack came alongside. Coffee, always coffee, dark enough to stand a spoon in and hot enough to be the best part of the meal by virtue of the warmth alone. Thomas had eaten this meal, or a version of it close enough to count as the same meal, 47 nights in a row. He did not think about what he was eating anymore. Thinking about what you were eating required comparing it to something else, and the thing you would compare it to was food from before. Food from home. Food that had been made by someone who cared what it tasted like, and that comparison was not useful. Thomas had learned this somewhere around week 3 and had since stopped making the comparison. He ate to maintain the machine. The machine was what mattered. Now here is the part that does not appear in the stories about the gold rush. The part that sits underneath all the gold and adventure and manifest destiny language that would get applied to this period later. The money was leaving, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, in small amounts that each seemed reasonable in isolation and were collectively fatal to the arithmetic Thomas was trying to make work. In the isolated camps of the Sierra Nevada foothills, prices for everything had reached levels that would have seemed impossible in the world these men came from. Every egg, every candle, every pound of flour, every sack of coffee, every piece of salt pork had to travel to get here. It traveled by ship to San Francisco, then by smaller boat up the Sacramento River, then overland by mule or wagon or human back over terrain that destroyed equipment and animals with reliable regularity. The price of a thing in a mining camp was not just the price of the thing, it was the price of the thing plus every mile it had traveled and every difficulty encountered along the way and the profit margin of every hand it had passed through. In the most isolated camps, prices became stories that men repeated with disbelief. Eggs, butter, candles, coffee, all of them costing more than they seemed morally allowed to cost. Not because merchants were always dishonest, but because every item had crossed distance and mud and rivers and theft and demand before it reached a hungry man, and all of that crossing had a price attached to it. The men who understood this before they arrived, who had thought clearly about the economics of the situation, were largely not the men standing in the creeks. A man named Samuel Brannan had traveled to California before the rush. acquired a supply of mining equipment, and then made sure the news of the gold discovery spread as widely and as fast as possible. He was not doing this as a public service. He was doing it because he had the equipment to sell and needed the customers. He became, by most accounts, the first millionaire of the California gold rush. He accomplished this without ever putting a pan in a creek. Levi Strauss came west to sell dry goods to the expanding California market. The copper-riveted work pants that would eventually carry his name came later, through a partnership with Jacob Davis in 1873. But the instinct that brought him to California in the first place was the same instinct Brannon had followed to identify the need. Position yourself to meet it, and let the market do what markets do. Philip Armour came west during the gold rush years and learned something about where the real money moved before building the meatpacking fortune that made his name permanent in American business. These men are still household names. The men who actually dug the gold are, with very few exceptions, not. Thomas knew some version of this. He was not naive about the economics, but knowing it and living inside it were different things. And living inside it meant that the $1.40 he had pulled from the creek yesterday was not going to stay $1.40 for long. Tonight's supper cost him money. The coffee cost him money. The candle he would burn later to write his letter home cost him an amount that would have bought him a week's worth of candles in Ohio. These were not extravagances. These were the minimum requirements of staying alive and functional in this place. He ate his beans and did the arithmetic. $1.40 in. Subtract the day's expenses. Subtract his share of the claim fee that the informal district arrangement required. Subtract the small amount he owed James Riordan from a loan 2 weeks ago. What remained was not nothing, but it was not moving him towards $600 at any speed that helped. The meal does not fill him. It subtracts from him. There were men in this camp who were making money. Thomas could see this, or see the signs of it. The merchant who ran the store tent, a man from New York named Bell, who had arrived with a wagon full of goods and never picked up a mining tool, was doing a visible and apparently thriving business every evening when the miners came back from the creek with their day's earnings, and immediately began converting those earnings into the supplies and comforts that Bell happened to have available for sale. Bell slept on a cot. Thomas knew this because he had seen the cot through the open flap of the store tent one morning. A cot was not a luxury exactly, but compared to the ground, it was a statement about how differently the gold rush was treating different people. Thomas searched the river for gold. Bell searched Thomas for need. Both men were working the same camp. One of them had found the better claim. Across the fire, Caleb Marsh was eating his beans with the methodical focus of a man getting through a task. Thomas watched him and thought about the gambling tent at the far end of camp, and remembered seeing Caleb walk in that direction 2 nights ago and not seeing him come back out before Thomas went to sleep. He did not ask about it. In a camp like this, you learn quickly what questions were useful and what questions were not. Useful questions had answers that changed your day. The other kind just opened up conversations that neither person had the resources to finish. Thomas scraped the last of the beans from his tin. He needed $600. He had been here 47 days. The beans were gone. Tomorrow there would be more beans. The coughing started before Thomas was fully awake. Not his cough. The man in the tent next to his a quiet fellow from Indiana named Prescott, who had been working the claim 2 spots down from Thomas since mid-June. Thomas had heard that cough for 6 nights now. At first, it was the kind of cough a man gets when he spends his days standing in cold water in all weather. A reasonable cough. The cough of a body making a complaint that the circumstances fully justified. But the cough had changed in the last 3 nights. It was lower now. Veta. It had a sound underneath it that Thomas recognized, without being able to name. The sound of something happening in the chest that was more serious than cold water and damp nights. Thomas lay in the dark and listened to it, and thought about the fact that Prescott had been at his claim again yesterday. All day. Working the same hours as everyone else. He had not said anything about it. Nobody had said anything about it. This was one of the rules of the camp that nobody wrote down, but everyone understood. You worked unless you could not work. The line between those 2 states was drawn much further toward the cannot than it would have been anywhere else, because the economics of stopping were severe and immediate. A day not working was a day not earning. A day not earning was a day longer in California. A day longer in California was a day further from wherever you were trying to get back to, measured in miles or in the faces of people waiting for you. So you worked. You worked with a bad back, and you worked with blisters that had stopped hurting, only because they had reached a depth where the nerves no longer reported from the surface, and you worked with a cough that had changed in ways you chose not to examine too closely. This was the contract everyone in the camp had signed, without it ever being written down. A trained doctor was not impossible to find in California in 1849, but finding one required distance and time and money that most miners could not spare. San Francisco had doctors. Some of the larger settlements along the main routes had men with medical training, or men who claimed it, which was not always the same thing, in the smaller camps scattered up the creeks and into the hills. When fever came at night, medicine meant whoever was nearby and whoever had seen something like this before. In Thomas's camp, that was a man named Holt. Holt was from Kentucky and had served briefly as a medical assistant during a military campaign he did not discuss in detail. What he had from that experience was not formal training, but something more practical. A working knowledge of what wounds and illness looked like in their early stages versus their late stages, and what the difference between those 2 stages meant for what you could reasonably do about it. He kept a canvas bag with supplies, cloth for bandaging, a small knife, needles and thread, laudanum, when he could get it, calomel and quinine, when someone had paid for them, several bottles whose labels promised more certainty than they could deliver, and whiskey, which served more purposes than any other item in the bag and made no promises it could not keep. Holt did not charge for his help. He also did not volunteer it. If you came to him, he would look at the problem and tell you what he thought and do what he could. If you did not come to him, that was your business. Most men did not come to him until the problem had progressed to a point where ignoring it was no longer a realistic option. The things that actually threatened life in the California mining camps of 1849 were not the things that appeared in the stories that would later be told about this period. The stories would emphasize violence and danger and the drama of men in extreme circumstances. These things were real. They were not the primary threat. The primary threat was the water. The creek that Thomas stood in every day to do his work was the same creek that everyone in the camp used for drinking. It was the same creek that the camps waste. human and otherwise, found its way into overtime. Nobody had designed this situation. Nobody had looked at a map and decided that the drinking water and the working water and the wastewater should all be the same water. It had simply evolved that way because the camp had grown faster than any thought about sanitation could keep up with. And by the time the problem was visible, the problem was already established. Dysentery moved through camps quietly, and then all at once, a man would feel off for a day. I attribute it to the food or the heat or the exertion. Keep working. Then he would feel worse. Then, usually within a few days, it was clear that this was not the food or the heat, and by then the man had been working alongside other men and drinking from the same source, and the same source had received what his body was now producing. And the cycle continued. Thomas's stomach had been unreliable for 2 weeks. He had not told anyone. He attributed it to the food, because the food was genuinely bad, and a reasonable explanation for most of what his body was doing, and because the alternative explanation was one he did not want to sit with. There was also scurvy, though the word was rarely used in camp because using the word made it real. After 6 weeks, without fresh vegetables or fruit, the body began to register the deficit in specific ways. Gums that ached in the mornings, joints that stiffened in the cold more than they should have, a fatigue that was different from work fatigue, deeper and less responsive to sleep. Thomas had noticed his gums 3 weeks ago and had said nothing to anyone, because saying something required acknowledging something, and acknowledging it did not change the supply situation. Fresh food existed in California. It was available in San Francisco and in the larger settlements. It arrived by ship from various points of origin and was sold at prices that reflected every mile of that journey. An egg in a mining camp could cost what a dozen eggs cost in Ohio. Butter was a luxury item. Fresh vegetables were something men talked about, the way they talked about their wives, with a longing that had physical dimensions. The camp kept 2 ledgers, one in dollars and one in the body. Thomas could read the first one clearly. He was only beginning to understand the second. Caleb Marsh, Thomas had noticed, was thinner than he had been in May. They all were. The work burned more than the food replaced, and the deficit accumulated in ways that showed eventually, in the face and the hands and the way a man moved at the end of a long day. Thomas had stopped looking at his own reflection in the creek water because what he saw there was not something he wanted to carry in his mind for the rest of the day. He was functional. He was working. He was not well in any full sense of the word. But wellness was not the standard here. The standard was, can you still stand in the creek with the pan? Thomas could still stand in the creek with the pan. He lay in his tent that night and listened to Prescott cough and thought about Holt and his canvas bag and whether it contained anything that helped with a chest that sounded like that. He thought about going to Holt and describing the sound and asking the question. He did not go. It was not his place to make that decision for Prescott. A man's body in this camp was his own business until the man chose to make it someone else's. But he listened to the cough in the dark, and he knew what he was hearing. He had heard something like it once before, back in Ohio. In the winter of 1845, his father had coughed like that for 3 weeks before he agreed to let anyone help. Thomas closed his eyes. The cough continued. The creek ran outside in the dark, moving all of it downstream. The gold and the waste and everything else. The way water moves everything eventually. patient, and without opinion about what it carries. The tent at night was 8 feet by 10 feet. That is smaller than it sounds. 8 feet by 10 feet with 2 other men in it, and the gear that 3 men need to work and sleep, and stay minimally functional in an outdoor environment for months, at a stretch. The pickaxes had to go somewhere. The extra blanket had to go somewhere. The personal items, the small things men carried from home that served no practical function, but whose presence made the difference between a life and a sentence, had to go somewhere. Thomas kept his in the left corner of the tent nearest his head. A photograph of Mary, taken the spring before he left. In front of the house that was currently the subject of a bank mortgage, and the entire reason he was in California. Mary was not smiling in the photograph because the photograph had taken a long time to arrange, and she had been holding the expression for several minutes by the time it was taken. But Thomas knew the expression that was almost there underneath the one she was holding. And he looked at that photograph most nights before the candle went out. A letter from her, the most recent one, describing William. Brown hair, loud when he wants something, looks like you round the eyes. A small Bible. Not because Thomas was a particularly religious man, but because his mother had pressed it into his hands when he left, and he had not been able to put it down before the wagon pulled away. That was everything. Those were the things that had made the cut, when the weight of everything had to be calculated against the distance to be covered. Sleep in a mining camp was a more complicated proposition than the word suggests. The ground was the ground. Thomas had a bedroll, a blanket folded over itself, and the canvas floor of the tent between him and the earth. And the earth's opinion of this arrangement was communicated nightly, through a combination of cold and dampness, and the particular unforgiving quality of soil that has been compacted by foot traffic but never smoothed or leveled. He had stopped noticing the discomfort of the ground sometime around the 3rd week, in the way that you stop noticing a sound that never stops. Not because it is gone, but because the brain makes a decision about what to process. The cold was harder to stop noticing. The Sierra Nevada foothills in July were warm in the day, sometimes hot, the kind of dry California heat that people back east imagined when they thought about California. The nights were different. The elevation drained the warmth fast when the sun went down, and by midnight the temperature had dropped to a range that none of the stories Thomas had read about California had prepared him for. He slept in his clothes most nights. He slept in his coat when the coat was dry, which it was, not always. From 20 feet away, the saloon tent ran until sometime after midnight, most nights. Thomas had grown used to this, the way he had grown used to the ground, not comfortably, but completely, so that the absence of it, when it finally stopped, was what woke him for a moment before he went back under. The sounds of 200 men sleeping were not peaceful sounds. They were the sounds of bodies that had worked too hard for too long, in conditions that were not designed for human comfort, doing what bodies do when finally released from the demands of consciousness, coughing, because Prescott was not the only one with a cough. Sounds of distress that the men making them were not aware of. The occasional voice saying something in sleep that bore no relationship to the waking world. And underneath all of it, always, the creek. Thomas lay on his back in the dark, with his eyes open, and thought about the thing he thought about most nights when the day was done, and there was nothing left between him and whatever his mind chose to do with the quiet. The gold in his small cloth bag was buried in the left corner of the tent, under the Bible, wrapped in the extra sock he never wore, because the condition of the ground made wearing good socks seem wasteful. He knew exactly where it was. He could have found it in complete darkness, with his eyes closed, which was essentially the situation he was in most nights when he thought about it. 7 weeks of work was in that bag. Not a lot, not nothing, but not a lot. The fear that lived underneath the arithmetic was not the fear of failing to reach $600. It was the fear of reaching $600 minus whatever was in that bag, because someone had gotten to it in the night. This fear was not irrational. Tools went missing in camp. Personal items went missing. There was no sheriff, and no jail, and no system for recovering what was taken. Only the informal mechanisms of camp society, which operated on reputation and social pressure and the threat of collective response, none of which returned what was gone. Thomas had never been robbed. He knew men who had. He slept in a way that was not quite sleep, a state of reduced consciousness that preserved some monitoring function, some background awareness of the sounds of the tent and the camp outside it. He could not have said when this had developed, or whether he had chosen it, or whether it had simply installed itself as a survival feature in the weeks since he arrived. He thought about Mary, not in an abstract way, in the specific way of someone trying to reconstruct a person from memory, detail by detail. The way she stood in the kitchen in the morning, the particular sound of her voice when she was concentrating on something, the way she had looked at him on the platform in Columbus when he boarded the train west, the expression she had not quite managed to make neutral. He thought about William. This was harder because it was based only on description. Brown hair, loud when he wants something, looks like you around the eyes. Thomas tried to build a face from those words and could not do it completely. He got part of a face that belonged to a person who was 4 months old tonight and growing in ways that Thomas was not present to see and would have to reconstruct later from photographs and from what Mary told him, fitting the pieces together into something he would eventually recognize as his son. 4 months old tonight. He had not been there for the first breath or the first cry or any of the days after that. He was here instead, in a tent that smelled like men and damp canvas, listening to Prescott cough through the wall, with a bag of gold under a Bible in the corner that might get him part way to the number he needed if nobody took it in the night. This was the trade he had made. He had made it with his eyes open. Knowing what he was trading, he had decided it was necessary. Most days he still believed that. But at 4 in the morning, in the dark, with the creek running outside and the camp breathing around him in its troubled sleep, the believing was harder work than the mining. He closed his eyes. He held the photograph of Mary in his mind, the one where she was almost smiling. He listened for any sound that was different from the sounds that belonged here. He waited for morning. Ephraim Bell had been in California 4 months longer than Thomas Ward. He had come by ship around Cape Horn. The long route, 6 months of ocean that took him past Brazil, and through the storms at the bottom of South America, and up the Pacific coast to San Francisco Bay. He had arrived in January of 1849 with a wagon, 2 mules, a hired man named Cortez, who spoke 3 languages and could repair almost anything mechanical, and enough capital to stock that wagon with goods that he had calculated before he left New York would be needed by the specific kind of man who would be arriving in California in large numbers over the following year. Bell was 34 years old and had been a merchant in Lower Manhattan for 9 years before California. He understood supply chains the way Thomas understood creek beds, which is to say, he understood them at the level of instinct, below the level of having to think about them, because he had been operating inside one long enough for the logic of it to become automatic. He had not come to California for gold. He had come because gold produced a particular human situation that was, from a commercial standpoint, extremely favorable. A large number of people in an isolated location with money to spend and very limited options for spending it. This was, Bell had explained to his brother before leaving New York, the best retail environment a merchant could hope for. Your customers cannot go elsewhere. Your competitors cannot easily reach you. Your goods, however ordinary, carry the value premium of scarcity. His store tent was at the north end of the camp, set slightly apart from the sleeping tents, in a way that made it feel like a separate institution, which it was. The tent itself was larger than any of the living quarters, with the back half serving as storage and the front half as the selling floor. A plank of wood across 2 barrels, serving as the counter. A lantern hung from the center post, providing light that made everything look slightly warmer and more inviting than the surrounding dark. Bell opened in the evenings when the miners came back from the creek. This timing was deliberate. Men who had worked all day and were tired and hungry were not men who were going to calculate carefully what things should cost. They were men who saw what they needed and paid what was asked, because the alternative was doing without. And doing without, when you were this tired and this far from home, was harder than the price. Thomas went to Bell's tent that night for a candle. He needed the candle to write his letter to Mary, which he had been putting off for 3 days, because writing the letter required a kind of honesty that was easier to defer than to perform. And also because candles cost money. That came directly out of the arithmetic he was trying to make work. Bell was behind the plank counter when Thomas came in, entering something in a ledger with a pencil. Not looking up, the candles were on the shelf behind him. Thomas told him what he wanted. Bell set down his pencil and turned and took a candle from the shelf and set it on the counter and named a price that was, by Thomas's calculation, approximately 4 times what a candle of that size cost in Ohio. Thomas paid it. He paid it because the candle was there and he needed it, and Bell was the only person selling candles within any reasonable distance. And because the alternative was writing the letter in the dark or not writing it at all, and he had already put it off 3 days. Bell took the money and returned to his ledger. He did not watch Thomas go. Thomas stood outside the store tent in the dark for a moment with the candle in his hand. Through the open flap he could see Bell writing in his ledger, the numbers accumulating on the page with the steady confidence of a man for whom the numbers were moving in the right direction. Bell had not dug a single pan of gravel since arriving in California. He would leave California richer than almost anyone in this camp. Not because he had found a better claim, because he had found a better position in the chain, a position where the gold came to him through the ordinary needs of ordinary men, steadily and reliably. 1 candle and 1 sack of flour and 1 pound of salt pork at a time. Thomas searched the river for gold. Bell searched Thomas for need. Both men were working the same camp. One of them had found the better claim, and it was the one that never required standing in cold water. This was the truth that sat underneath the gold rush, that the gold rush preferred not to advertise. The men who would be remembered, whose names would attach themselves to companies and brands and institutions that outlasted the rush itself, were largely not the men who had panned the creeks. They were the men who had positioned themselves at the points where gold naturally flowed out of the hands of the men who found it. The merchants, the shippers, the landlords of the tent hotels in Sacramento and San Francisco, the operators of the gambling establishments and the saloons, the lawyers, Lauter, who sorted out the claim disputes and the estate questions that accumulated when men died far from home without clear arrangements. The gold came out of the ground by the labor of men like Thomas. Then it moved. It moved through Bell's ledger, and through the gambling tent, and through the saloon, and through the inflated prices of every ordinary commodity, and it moved through the infrastructure of San Francisco, which was growing into a real city on the back of the commercial activity the rush was generating. And it moved eventually east and into the broader American economy. The men who dug it mostly kept enough to stay and keep digging. That was the system, and the system worked exactly as designed. And Thomas understood it the way you understand the weather, clearly and without any particular ability to do something about it. He walked back toward his tent with the candle. Behind him, Bell went back to his numbers. The lantern in the store tent burned until late, because Bell's evening was just beginning when the miners' evenings were winding down, and there was still a good hour of commerce left in the night before the remaining customers were not worth waiting for. Thomas lit his own candle when he got back to the tent. He sat with the paper and the pencil and the small pool of light the candle threw against the canvas wall. He thought about what he was going to say to Mary, and what he was not going to say to Mary. And the distance between those two things was the distance between what was true and what was sendable. The candle burned. $600. The candle burned. Picture the gambling saloon as the stories told it. Green felt tables under warm lamplight. Men in good hats with cards in their hands and whiskey at their elbows. The atmosphere of risk worn lightly, like something exciting is always just about to happen. The dealer smooth and professional. The money moving back and forth with a kind of elegant fatalism. This is the version that ended up in paintings and in novels and eventually in 100 years of films. And it is not entirely wrong, but it misses something important about why the men were actually there. Thomas stood at the entrance to the gambling tent at 9 o'clock that evening. He did not go in. He stood at the edge of the lamplight and looked at the men inside and thought about what he was looking at. Because looking at it carefully was something he could do from here that he could not do from inside it. The tent held maybe 30 men on a busy night. There were 3 tables. One ran a game called Faro, which was the most popular card game in the mining camps of California in 1849. Simple enough to learn in a few minutes, and fast enough that money could change hands many times in an hour. One ran Monte, a card game that the Sonoran miners had brought north with them, and that had spread through the camps the way useful things spread, regardless of where they started. The third table was for poker, which moved slower and drew a specific kind of player. Men who wanted more control over the pace of the game and who either had the patience or the belief that patience was a skill that could overcome the mathematics of chance. The men at the tables did not look like men who were having fun. This was the thing that struck Thomas every time he stood here. The pictures of gambling showed pleasure, the pleasure of risk and possibility. What he saw at the tables was something different, something harder to name, but visible if you knew how to look for it. The faces of men who were concentrating very hard on something. The faces of men for whom the stakes were real in a way that was not compatible with fun. Consider what a pan represented. A pan was a full day of standing in cold water with your back bent and the sun either too hot or absent, and the result uncertain. A full day of that might produce $1, might produce 2, might produce nothing. The uncertainty was total. The control was minimal. And the result came at the end of 11 hours of hard physical work that left no energy for processing disappointment. A card game was different. A card game could produce a result in 3 minutes. The uncertainty was the same. The control was equally minimal, perhaps less so. But the speed of it, the compression of hope and outcome into a short interval, had a quality that the slow grind of the creek did not have. Something could happen now, not tomorrow, not after another month of beans and cold water, but now, in the next hand, in the next turn of the card. A pan made a man wait all day to be disappointed. A card could disappoint him in seconds. And somehow, that felt more merciful. Thomas saw Caleb Marsh at the faro table. He had not expected to see Caleb. Caleb was not, in Thomas's understanding of him, a gambling man, or at least had not seemed like one in the weeks they had known each other. But there he was, at the far table, with a stack of coins in front of him that represented, Thomas estimated, somewhere between 2 and 3 days of Caleb's recent earnings. Thomas watched. Caleb played a hand and won. The dealer paid him with the flat efficiency of someone for whom winning and losing were interchangeable events. Caleb looked at his winnings and then, without visible hesitation, pushed them all back onto the table. He played another hand. He lost. He reached into his coat pocket and produced more coins. Thomas watched the expression on Caleb's face as this happened, and what he saw was not desperation, or the looseness of a man who had been drinking, or the bright-eyed excitement of someone seduced by possibility. What he saw was concentration, the focused, inward-looking concentration of a man doing arithmetic in his head, not gambling arithmetic, not odds and probabilities, but a different kind of arithmetic entirely. The arithmetic of whether staying was still possible. Thomas understood this because he knew the arithmetic himself, ran it every night before sleep, felt it running in the background during the day like a second heartbeat. The arithmetic of $600 and what remained and how long it would take at the current rate and whether the current rate could be sustained and what happened if it could not. The gambling table offered a solution to that arithmetic that the creek did not offer. Not a good solution, not a reliable solution, a solution that was more likely to make the arithmetic worse than better, and that Caleb certainly understood in some part of himself that was still calculating clearly, but a solution with a different shape than the creek's solution, a shape that allowed for a large change in a single evening instead of the slow accumulation that the creek demanded. The creek asked for patience. The card table asked for hope. After 7 weeks, patience was in shorter supply than hope. And the card table knew this, and the men who ran the card table were professionals at knowing this, which was why they were there. The dealers in the gambling tent were not miners. They were men who had come to California with a specific and portable skill, the skill of extracting money from men who had money and wanted more of it. Many of them had worked the riverboats on the Mississippi and the Ohio before this, where the same skill applied to the same basic human situation. Men in transit with earnings and time and the desire for something to happen. California had given them the largest and most isolated market they had ever encountered, and they had arrived for it the way Bell had arrived for it, understanding what it offered before the miners themselves had fully processed what they were walking into. The man running the faro table had the hands of someone who had done this for a long time. The cards moved through them without effort. The dealing and the collection and the payout, all part of a single continuous motion that had been performed enough times to become something other than action, closer to reflex. He looked at every player with the same expression, not predatory, not friendly, just present, attentive, professionally neutral. The way a man is neutral about a job he has been doing long enough to have stopped having feelings about it. Thomas stepped back from the entrance. He did not go in. He had made this calculation before and would make it again. And the calculation always came out the same. If he lost $20 tonight, he would need 2 additional weeks in California. 2 weeks was 14 days. 14 days was 14 days that William grew without his father present. He did not think about money in the abstract. He thought about it in days, because days were what the money represented, and days were what he was spending, and the rate at which he was spending them was the only number that mattered. He walked back toward his tent. Behind him, inside the lamp-lit tent, the cards moved through the dealer's hands with the steady rhythm of something that had been running a long time and intended to keep running long after everyone who sat at the table tonight had gone home or given up or run out of coins to push across the felt. Caleb Marsh was still at the table when Thomas left. Thomas did not look back. He told himself this was because looking back was not useful. This was true, and it was not the whole truth. And Thomas knew the difference, but let it go, because some things were easier to carry in the dark when you did not look at them directly. Thomas heard the fiddle before he saw the fire. He was walking back from the gambling tent, the candle in his coat pocket, the night air cold enough now that his breath made a small cloud in front of him with each exhale. The camp was in its middle phase, past the first rush of the evening but not yet into the quiet of the late hours. And the sounds it made were the sounds of men in the process of deciding what kind of night this was going to be. The fiddle was coming from the far side of the main cooking area, where someone had built the fire higher than necessary for warmth, and where a group of maybe 20 men had gathered in the loose, non-committal way of people who have not decided to stay but have not decided to leave. Thomas stopped walking. The song was not a song he could name. It was in a minor key, the kind of melody that does not resolve the way you expect it to, that keeps turning back on itself. And it had a quality that he recognized before he could identify what he was recognizing. He had heard something like it in church as a boy. In the Methodist congregation, his mother had taken him to every Sunday in Licking County, Ohio. Not the same song, the same feeling underneath the song. the feeling of people using music to say something they could not say directly. He walked toward the fire. A man from Georgia, named Aldridge, was playing the fiddle, sitting on an upended crate, with the instrument tucked under his chin and his eyes mostly closed, moving through the melody with the ease of someone who had been playing since before he could explain what playing was. Beside him, a man Thomas did not know was providing a lower sound with a harmonica, not leading, just filling in the spaces Aldridge left. The two instruments finding each other by instinct in the way of people who have played together before, or who are simply listening carefully enough to each other that it amounts to the same thing. The men around the fire were not dancing. They were not doing anything active. They were listening in the particular way that people listen to music, when the music is touching something they have not been able to touch themselves. Which is to say, they were very still and not looking at each other. Thomas found a place at the edge of the fire and stood there. The song changed. Aldridge moved into something Thomas knew immediately. Knew from the first 3 notes. Because everyone in America knew it by 1849. It had spread that fast and that far in the 2 years since it was written. Oh, Susanna, the song that had become, without anyone officially designating it as such, the unofficial anthem of the gold rush, sung on the trails west and on the ships rounding the Horn, and in the camps from the American River to the Feather River, and every tributary between them. Listen to what the song is actually about. A man leaving the woman he loves, leaving the place he belongs, heading somewhere else because something has pulled him there, and trying to make the leaving sound like adventure rather than loss. The melody is bright and the rhythm is fast, and if you are not paying attention to the words, it sounds like a cheerful song, the kind of song you sing when things are going well. But the words are about a man who has gone somewhere and is not sure he should have. This was the song of the gold rush. Not because it was about gold. It was not. But because it was about the feeling underneath the gold. The feeling that every man in this camp carried, and mostly did not talk about. The feeling of having left something real for something that might not be. Thomas listened and felt it move through him the way music moves through you when it is accurate. Consider what whiskey was doing in this camp and why. Some men trusted whiskey more than creek water. And this was not entirely unreasonable. The creek water's problems were invisible and cumulative and revealed themselves over weeks. The whiskey's problems were visible and immediate and mostly recoverable. Some men trusted it more than what they could see floating past in the current of the drinking water. And in the absence of better options, that trust was not without logic. But whiskey in the camp was not primarily about safety. It was about the specific problem of being a man in a place like this, surrounded by other men, all of whom were carrying the same weight of fear and longing and uncertainty, none of whom had a language for it that the situation permitted. The camp had a strong informal rule against showing the thing underneath. You did not say you were afraid. You did not say you missed your wife with a physical ache that had no remedy available here. You did not say you were beginning to wonder whether the calculation that had brought you here was going to work out the way you needed it to. These things were true for almost everyone. None of them were sayable in the direct sense. Whiskey created a partial exception to this rule, not by making men honest exactly, but by creating a condition in which the edges of things softened enough that something could get through that could not get through at full sobriety. A man could talk about home after 2 drinks in a way he could not talk about it before 2 drinks. Not because the drinks changed what was true, but because they changed the distance between what was true and what could be said. The music was the same thing without the drinks. This was why men gathered around fires and listened to fiddles and harmonicas play songs about leaving and longing. Because the music created a space where the feeling was permitted to exist without anyone having to claim it personally. The feeling was in the song. Everyone could feel it because it was in the song. Nobody had to say, "I feel this," which was the formulation that the camp's rules did not allow. Thomas stood at the fire and felt the song do what it was doing and let it do it. He had not cried since he left Ohio. He was not going to cry here, at this fire, in front of 20 men who would remember it. But there was a state between not feeling and crying that he had been living in for 7 weeks. A state with no name, where the feeling was present and contained and going nowhere. And the music got close to it in a way that nothing else in the camp did. Aldridge played through "Oh Susanna" and came out the other side into something slower. Thomas recognized the slower song before he could name it. His mother had known it. She had hummed it in the kitchen on winter mornings when she thought no one was listening. A melody that belonged to a private feeling she had never described to him and that he had understood without description. The way children understand the emotional weather of the people closest to them before they have language for it. He stood at the fire for 2 more minutes. Then he walked back toward his tent before the song finished. He did not want to be standing at that fire when it ended. In the silence that would come after, when the space the music had created would collapse and the camp would reassemble itself from whatever the music had briefly taken apart. He had a letter to write. The candle in his pocket was already paid for. He owed it to himself to use it for what he had paid for it. Later, when he was in his tent with the candle lit and the paper in front of him, he could still hear the fiddle from across the camp, faint now and further away. Aldridge still playing into the night for whoever was still listening. Thomas picked up his pencil. He thought about what he was going to say. The candle threw a small circle of light onto the paper. Outside the circle, the dark. Picture the frontier as the stories told it. A sheriff with a badge that caught the light. A courthouse with steps wide enough for justice to descend them properly. The law arriving on horseback or riding the circuit or standing in a doorway with the unmistakable posture of someone authorized to represent something larger than himself. Order imposed on chaos by the specific and legitimate force of institution. California, in 1849, had none of this. Formal law was thin, distant, and unevenly applied. California was not yet a state and would not become one until September of 1850. The military government that had nominally controlled the territory after the Mexican War was not equipped for what was happening in the foothills. In the meantime, the men in the camps managed it themselves. The primary instrument of self-governance in the California gold camps was the miners' meeting. When a dispute arose, when a question needed resolving, when a decision needed to be made that affected more than one person, the practice was to call a meeting of the miners in the district, all of whom were entitled to participate and to work out the answer collectively. This system had genuine advantages. It was fast, because it operated on foot rather than on the timeline of institutions. It was local, because the men deciding were the men affected. It was responsive, because it could be convened in an evening and conclude by midnight, in a situation where the alternative was no resolution at all. The miners' meeting provided something, and something was better than nothing, in a place where the stakes of unresolved disputes were high, and the capacity for violence was present and not far below the surface. The system also had limits that became apparent in the using. The claim did not belong to Thomas because the earth said so. It belonged to him because enough men agreed not to challenge it today. That agreement was real. It had held for 7 weeks. But it was an agreement. And the difference between an agreement and a right was the distance between security and the feeling of security, which could look the same from the outside and be very different things to live inside. Thomas had understood this theoretically since the first week. He understood it less theoretically after what happened at the lower end of the creek 3 days ago. A miner named Santos, one of the Sonoran group working the Downstream section, had been accused of encroaching on the adjacent claim of a man named Fitch from Connecticut. Fitch said Santos had moved his stakes overnight and was working ground that did not belong to him. Santos said the stakes had been placed correctly, and that Fitch was misremembering where the original boundary had been. There were no witnesses to the original staking who could say definitively what the correct position was. A miners' meeting was called for the evening. Thomas attended because attendance at meetings of this kind was not officially required but was, in practice, expected, because the weight of collective decision-making required collective presence, and because not attending was a statement of a kind that men in camps did not make casually. The meeting lasted 2 hours. The arguments were made by both men and by others on their behalf, in English, which meant that Santos was arguing through a partial language barrier that Fitch was not. The men listening were predominantly Anglo-American, which meant that the default assumptions in the room were the assumptions of one culture rather than both. These facts were not discussed as facts. They were simply the conditions under which the meeting occurred. The decision went against Santos. He was required to pull his stakes back to a position that Fitch's supporters indicated as correct. He had no practical recourse. The miners' meeting had spoken. The miners' meeting was the only authority available. Thomas had listened to the arguments and could not determine, with confidence, who was right. He had watched Santos's face during the proceedings. The particular stillness of a man translating in real time, and understanding enough to know how things were going, and not quite enough to intervene effectively. He had watched Fitch, who was not a bad man, not visibly a bad man, just a man who believed he was right and had the advantage of arguing in the language everyone present shared. After the meeting broke up, Thomas had walked back to his tent alone. He had not slept well. The question that had moved through him in the hours after the meeting was not whether Santos had been treated fairly, though he thought about that. The question that had settled into him and refused to leave was more personal than that. If it were him, if someone disputed his claim, and he stood in front of a meeting of 200 men and made his argument, what protected him? The answer was the men who knew him. The men who had been here long enough to have formed an opinion of him that was favorable, or at least neutral. The men who, when a decision needed to be made about whether his account of events was more credible than someone else's account, would weigh the question with some information about who Thomas Ward was. 7 weeks of being present and visible and conducting himself in the ways that produced a tolerable reputation in a camp. That was the protection available. Not a court, not a written record, not a deed, not a badge. His name in the minds of enough men who were present and willing to say it. This was not nothing. It was also not enough to sleep soundly on. He had written about it that night in his notebook. Not the specific dispute, not Santa's name, just the question. The version of the question that was about himself. In a place with no courts, a man's safety depended not on his innocence, but on how many people in the room were willing to say his name at the right moment. He closed the notebook and lay back and listened to the creek. The creek moved through all of this without having an opinion about any of it. The creek had been here before the camps and the claims and the miners' meetings and the disputes about where the stakes belonged. The creek would be here after. The gold it carried had been in these mountains for longer than anyone who wanted it had existed on this continent. For now it was passing through a particular moment in time when men were standing in it and arguing about who had the right to stand where. And the river moved through that argument the way it moved through everything. Slow, steadily, without sides, carrying whatever it carried downstream and away from here. Thomas stared at the canvas ceiling. He thought about Santos pulling his stakes. He thought about Caleb at the gambling table. He thought about Bell and his ledger. He thought about $600. The camp breathed around him in the dark. All of it. The disputes and the hunger and the hope and the fear and the fiddle music that had already faded. All of it breathing together in the dark, like a single, enormous thing that had not yet decided what it was going to become. He was part of it. He had no choice but to be part of it. In the morning he would go back to the creek, for now there was only the dark and the sound of the water and the specific loneliness of a man who was surrounded by people and could not quite reach any of them. Thomas wrote 2 words in his notebook the night of August 3rd. Did not sleep? That was all. He had started a longer entry and then stopped, because the longer entry required him to put into words something he was not sure he had the right words for yet. Something that was still moving through him, like the cold of the creek water moves through you after you step out. Not gone, just redistributed. Present in places you did not expect. He had been to Coloma that day, a camp about 4 miles north, larger than his own, older by a few months, with a reputation as a rough place that the name of the nearest settlement, Hangtown, did not exactly contradict. He had gone to find a man from home, someone who had been in the same church congregation in Licking County, and whose presence in the California goldfields had been communicated to Thomas through a letter from Mary, who had heard it from the man's wife. The information traveling the long chain from California to Ohio and back to California in the way that information traveled in 1849, slowly and with significant loss of detail at each transfer. He had found the man. His name was Garrett, and he was thinner than Thomas remembered and was doing, he said, well enough. They had talked for an hour at the edge of Garrett's claim, and Thomas had come away with the particular feeling of having seen someone you know, in circumstances that alter what you know about them. He had stayed in Coloma longer than he intended. He had stayed because of what happened at 7 o'clock that evening. It began with an accusation. A miner named Crawford, originally from Virginia, announced to the men gathering at the central fire that his gold had been stolen. A specific amount, a significant amount, the product of several days of exceptional work that he had kept in his tent because the tent felt safer than carrying it. He had gone to check it that afternoon and found it gone. And he had an idea about who had taken it. And the idea had a name. The name was a Chilean miner who worked a claim on the other side of the main creek, a man Thomas had seen from a distance but did not know. The basis for Crawford's certainty was not what you would call evidence in any formal sense. The Chilean man had been seen near the area of Crawford's tent that afternoon. He had been seen before near areas where he had no particular business being. He was, Crawford said, the kind of man who would do this. And the men listening to Crawford appeared to largely share this assessment, or were not prepared to argue against it in the moment, which produced the same practical result. A miners' meeting was called. Thomas stood at the edge of the gathering and watched it proceed. Here is the thing about a miners' meeting that becomes clear when you watch one happen under these specific conditions. When the accusation is recent and the accused does not share a language with most of the men deciding, and the evening is cold and the mood is not patient, it moves fast. The formal version of a miners' meeting, the version that the camps had developed in calmer circumstances to handle claim disputes and water rights and the ordinary disagreements of men living at close quarters, had a procedure. Arguments were made by both sides. Witnesses were called. A vote was taken. The result was binding. The version that happened that evening in Coloma had the shape of a procedure without the content of one. Arguments were made by Crawford and by the men who agreed with Crawford, which was most of the men present. The Chilean man argued in Spanish that was translated imperfectly by someone who spoke approximate Spanish rather than fluent Spanish. And what came through the translation was a version of his argument that was thinner and less certain than whatever he was actually saying. Witnesses were called. The witnesses had seen him near the tent. Whether near the tent was the same as inside the tent was a distinction that the meeting did not linger on. The vote took about 3 minutes. The punishment that followed was a thing Thomas was not going to write down in detail in any letter he sent to anyone who might want to preserve it. It was a thing that communities do when the formal mechanisms that are supposed to contain collective anger are not present. When the anger is real, and the certainty is strong, and the evening is cold, and there are enough men who have been holding various frustrations long enough that the outlet feels, in the moment, like relief. Hangtown was not the entire gold rush, but it was not an isolated incident either. What it was a demonstration of the specific danger that lived inside the vacuum where formal law had not yet arrived. The danger was not that men were bad. The danger was that men in groups, under pressure, with real grievances and no functioning courts, could move from accusation to punishment faster than truth could travel, and that the speed of the movement felt from inside it, like decisiveness rather than error. Punishment moved faster than proof. This was not because the men at that fire were monsters. It was because they were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, tired and afraid and far from anything that usually held them in place. And the thing that usually held them in place was exactly what was missing here. Thomas stood at the edge of it and watched it happen. He did not step in. He told himself afterward that stepping in would have changed nothing. That a single voice against a crowd that has already made its decision does not alter the decision, but does alter the position of the voice. And that he was a man alone in California with no resources to spare for the consequences of being on the wrong side of 200 men. This was true. It was not the whole truth. And the part that was not the whole truth was what kept him awake on August 3rd, and what kept him from writing more than 2 words in his notebook. The Chilean man left Coloma that night. Whether by his own choice or by instruction, Thomas did not know. Whether he had taken Crawford's gold, Thomas did not know either. Crawford's certainty had not transmitted itself fully to Thomas through the watching of the evening. Had remained Crawford's certainty rather than becoming Thomas's certainty. And this gap between what Crawford knew and what Thomas could verify was the thing that made the evening impossible to put down. Innocence mattered less in the dark than witnesses. This was what Thomas had learned, or had confirmed, at the fire in Coloma on the evening of August 3rd. Not as a principle he could argue against. As a fact he had observed in operation, close enough to touch. He walked back to his own camp in the dark, with the 4 miles feeling longer than 4 miles. The stars over the Sierra Nevada were very clear that night. They were always clear here, away from the cities. The sky doing what it does when nothing competes with it, presenting itself in full. Thomas did not look at them. He looked at the path in front of his feet and thought about Santos's stakes being moved and the Chilean man being pushed out of Coloma and the particular shape of a system that was supposed to be about fairness and kept arriving at outcomes that went one direction more than the other. He thought about the fact that his claim was currently staked and unattended. He walked faster. When he got back to camp, he checked his stakes in the dark by feel, running his hands along the ropes to the posts, confirming the positions he had memorized. They were where he had left them. He checked his tent. Everything as he had left it. He went inside. He wrote 2 words. He lay in the dark and listened to the creek, and thought about a man he did not know, walking away from Coloma in the dark, with whatever he had been carrying when he arrived, and whatever he was carrying now that was different and heavier, and had no name in any language Thomas spoke. The camp breathed around him. He went to sleep eventually. The way you go to sleep, when sleep is what the body insists on, even when the mind has not finished with the day. In the morning the creek was where it always was. The claim was where he had left it. He went to work. The man had come from the north. Thomas did not know his name. Nobody seemed to know his name, or if they knew it, they did not use it, referring to him only as the man from the north, which was the most important thing about him from the camp's perspective. More important than his name or his face or the state he had come from, because what he carried from the north was information. And information in a mining camp was more valuable than almost anything you could carry on your back. He arrived at the main fire around 6 in the evening, his horse dusty, and his coat marked with the specific combination of trail and weather that meant several days of travel. He accepted coffee from Wallace, who ran the cooking fire at the center of camp and who treated the arrival of anyone with news with the practical hospitality of a man who understood that news was a resource like water or wood, something the camp needed to function. The man drank his coffee and talked. He had been at a camp called Dry Creek, he said, about 12 miles north and east of here, up into the hills, where the terrain got harder and the timber got thicker, and most of the early prospectors had not bothered going because there were easier places closer to the established routes. He had gone because a man he trusted had told him something worth going to check. And what he had found when he got there was worth reporting. The ground was producing more than here. The men working the creek at Dry Creek were pulling out amounts that had made him stop and look twice to confirm what he was seeing. Amounts that made the take at this camp look like what it actually was, which was modest, and getting more modest as the easy ground was worked out. Thomas listened from the edge of the fire. He had learned, in 7 weeks, how to listen to this kind of report, how to separate what the man was actually saying from the way he was saying it, from the inflation that happened naturally when a person carried a story through several days of travel and each telling made it slightly larger, not from dishonesty, but from the ordinary way that significant experiences grow in the telling. He had learned to apply a discount to every number he heard in this context, to ask himself what the story would look like if you took 30% off the top and still believed the rest, even discounted. The report was interesting. This was the problem with rumors in a mining camp. They were almost never entirely false. Gold was genuinely distributed unevenly through the terrain, and there genuinely were places where the concentration was higher and places where it was lower. And the difference between those places was real and significant and worth knowing. The rumor system was an imperfect but not useless way of tracking that information, because men moved through the landscape and men talked, and over time the talking produced a map of sorts, crude and unreliable, but responsive to actual conditions in a way that no official source was yet equipped to provide. The man from the north was not lying. He might have been mistaken. He might have seen a good day rather than a good place. He might have arrived at Dry Creek at a moment that was not representative of the general conditions there. These were real possibilities that the evening fire could not resolve. But he was not lying. Thomas stood at the edge of the fire and did the arithmetic that every man at that fire was doing simultaneously, each one working the numbers in private while the conversation continued around them. 12 miles. 12 miles of Sierra Nevada, terrain on foot with tools and supplies. 2 days minimum. Possibly 3, depending on conditions. Call it 2 days of travel in each direction. If he went, and the rumor was true, he would be working better ground. Better ground meant better daily yields. Better daily yields meant faster progress towards $600. Faster progress towards $600 meant earlier return to Ohio. Earlier return to Ohio meant seeing William while William was still young enough that the absence of a father could be absorbed and overcome rather than calcified into something permanent. If he went, and the rumor was false, he would have spent 4 days traveling to no purpose. He would have lost 4 days of work at his current claim, which was producing modest but real amounts. He would have returned to find his claim potentially taken by someone who had moved in while he was absent, because an unworked claim in a mining district was an available claim by the informal rules that governed such things, and he would have spent the provisions the journey required. This was the part of the arithmetic that did not show up in the simple version. Every day of travel cost money in food and supplies. Every day away from the claim was a day the claim produced nothing and potentially ceased to be his. The cost of chasing a rumor was not just the travel time. It was the travel time, plus the lost production, plus the claim risk, plus the possibility that the rumor was wrong. Against all of that, the possibility that the rumor was right, Thomas looked at the man from the north, who was now eating something Wallace had produced for him. Eating with the focused efficiency of someone who had not eaten properly in several days. Not performing for the audience around him. just eating. The man looked like someone who had seen what he said he had seen. He also looked like someone who had ridden 12 miles to tell people about it, which was a thing people did when they wanted to believe something was true badly enough that the telling of it confirmed the believing. Around the fire, Thomas could see the same arithmetic moving through the faces of the other men. The slight forward lean of attention, the eyes that were not quite focused on the fire but on something behind the fire, some interior calculation playing out against the backdrop of the flames. Men who had been here for weeks or months, who had developed a relationship with their current claims that was complicated and difficult and producing less than they had hoped, now weighing that against the possibility of somewhere better. This was the permanent condition of the gold rush, not the finding, the considering of whether to go somewhere else. The gold was never quite where you were. It was always possibly somewhere else. Somewhere just over the ridge, or up the next creek, or in the ground that the other group was working. The information was always partial, always filtered through the motivations of the person providing it, always impossible to verify in advance. And the cost of staying in a place that was not producing was real, measured in days and dollars, and the slow erosion of whatever certainty a man had arrived with. Thomas thought about his claim. 47 days. 7 weeks of learning this particular stretch of creek. Learning where the gold concentrated and where it did not. Learning the way the current moved over the bottom and what that meant for where the heavy particles settled. He had gotten better at this creek. He was pulling more from it now than he had in the first 2 weeks. Not because there was more gold, but because he understood it better. If he went to Dry Creek, he would start that learning over. If he stayed, he would keep producing what he was producing. If the rumor was true and he stayed, he would spend the rest of his time in California wondering whether the choice to stay was the choice that kept him here twice as long. If the rumor was false and he went, he would spend 4 days and come back and have nothing to show for it, and the claim might be gone. He did not make a decision that night. He could not make a decision that night because the information required to make the decision well was not available that night and would not be available until someone went to Dry Creek and came back with a report. And by the time that report arrived, the situation at Dry Creek might have changed. Because the situation anywhere changed as soon as enough men knew about it and started moving toward it. This was the thing that exhausted Thomas more than the work. The work was hard, but it was legible. You dug, you panned, you got a result. The result was real. The work asked everything from his body and gave him something he could hold and weigh and add to the total. The deciding was different. The deciding asked something from a part of him that the work did not ask from. A part that was already tired from 7 weeks of the same unanswerable questions, and it gave him nothing in return except more questions and the vague, persistent awareness that the decision he made might be the one he would think about for the rest of his life, either way. He walked back to his tent. The man from the north was still at the fire, still eating, still answering questions from the men who had gathered closer as the evening went on. Thomas did not look back. He lay in his tent in the dark and felt the not deciding settle into him like the cold settled into his joints, slowly and completely, and thought about the fact that hope and desperation felt exactly the same from the inside when you were tired enough. Somewhere north of here, 12 miles into harder country, a creek was either producing what the man said it was producing, or it was not. The night offered no way to know which. It offered only the waiting. Thomas closed his eyes. He waited. Stand at Thomas's claim and look north along the creek. The water comes down from the higher elevations, cold and fast where it falls over the granite shelves, and slower and wider where it spreads into the flat sections. And as it moves, it carries what the mountains release into it, sediment and mineral, and the heavy particles that settle according to weight when the current slows. Gold is heavy, heavier than almost anything else the water carries. When the current slows, the gold drops first. The best ground is where the current has slowed the longest. The best ground along this creek had been claimed in the first days of the camp by the men who arrived first, which meant the men who had traveled fastest and lightest, which meant, in the summer of 1849, largely the men from the eastern states who had come overland or on fast ships, and who had moved from San Francisco into the hills with a directness and a confidence that came from arriving in a place and recognizing it, or believing they recognized it, as somewhere they had a right to be. The men from Sonora had arrived with more knowledge and less speed. They knew this work. Their fathers had known it, and their fathers before them, in the silver mines of northern Mexico and in the gold-bearing streams of Sonora. Generations of accumulated understanding about how to read terrain and water and rock for what was underneath. The techniques that every man in this camp was using, or attempting to use, had largely come from this tradition, borrowed or observed or taken outright. In the early months of the rush, when the Sonoran miners were the ones who knew what to do, and the American miners were the ones watching them do it and making their own adjustments. By the time most of the Sonoran miners arrived at the camps in significant numbers, the best ground was already staked, not by law, by presence, by the informal logic of a place that rewarded arriving first and asked few other questions. So long as you arrived with the right face and the right language and the right set of unspoken assumptions about who this country was for, the Sonoran miners worked the downstream section. Downstream meant the water that had already passed through the upstream claims, that had been disturbed and muddied by the work happening above, that carried less of the concentrated deposits because the concentrated deposits were being extracted by the men above them. Downstream was harder work for less return, and it was where the men who had not gotten to the upstream ground first were working. And the distribution of who was upstream and who was downstream in this camp was not random. Thomas knew this, the way he knew the creek's geography. From direct observation over 7 weeks, he had adjusted his own technique 3 weeks ago by watching Rodrigo, one of the Sonoran miners, work the far bank with a rocker that processed material faster and with less physical effort than the pan Thomas had been using. He had watched for 4 days before he understood what Rodrigo was doing differently. Then he had modified his approach. His daily yield had improved. He had not said where the improvement came from. He had not done this from malice. He had not thought about it in the way that would have required him to characterize it as anything. He had seen something useful, absorbed it, used it, and moved on, which was how most learning happened in the camp. Practical and immediate, and without much ceremony around the transaction. But he had not said where it came from. And now, standing at his claim and looking downstream at Rodrigo, working the inferior ground with the same technique Thomas was using upstream. He thought about that for the first time in a way that was not comfortable. He did not throw the Sonoran man out. He also did not say his name when the others did. In the meetings, in the conversations at the fire, where the allocation of ground and water rights was discussed, and the outcomes of those discussions settled along lines that Thomas could see clearly when he looked at who worked where. This was not cruelty. It was the kind of silence that a man in Thomas's position could tell himself was not a choice. But it was. In the summer of 1849, the pressure on the non-Anglo miners in the California camps was largely social rather than legal. It operated through the informal mechanisms of a community making collective decisions without written rules. And those informal mechanisms, like all informal mechanisms, reflected the assumptions and the power of the people who dominated them. A year later, in the summer of 1850, California would formalize some of this pressure into law. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 required any miner who was not native-born American or who had not become a citizen under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to pay $20 per month for a license to mine. $20 per month was, for most miners, a significant portion of their earnings. For the Sonoran miners, specifically, men who had come to California because their skill and their knowledge and their family connections made it a reasonable prospect. It was a tax designed not to generate revenue, but to generate departure. In 1849, that law had not yet been written, but the feeling that would produce the law was already present in the camps. In the meetings, in the conversations at the fire, in the distribution of upstream and downstream along a creek where the current carried everything according to weight, and the men had arranged themselves according to something else entirely. Thomas had felt it in the meeting about Santos's stakes. He had felt it in the way conversations at the fire shifted when certain men were present and shifted again when they left. He had felt it, if he was honest with himself, in his own silence when the conversations moved in directions that did not benefit the men who worked downstream, further along the creek, past the Sonoran claims and past the section where the two Chilean miners worked. There was a man Thomas had noticed twice in the past 2 weeks. He was working a small stretch of ground at the edge of the district, a section that nobody had wanted because the access was difficult, and the ground had been assessed early as unlikely to produce much. He worked it alone. He was black, free, from somewhere in the eastern states, from what Thomas could determine, though he had never spoken to him directly. Freedom in California, in 1849, was a complicated word. California was, technically, free territory, having been taken from Mexico, which had abolished slavery in 1829. The question of what this meant for the black men who came to California as part of the rush, whether free or enslaved, was being worked out in practice in the camps and settlements through the same informal mechanisms that worked out everything else, which meant it was being worked out imperfectly and with results that depended heavily on local circumstance and local attitude. The man at the edge of the district had staked a claim that nobody contested, on ground that nobody else wanted, and he worked it every day from before sunup to after dark. Thomas had seen him from a distance a dozen times. He had not spoken to him. Nobody that Thomas knew of had spoken to him. He worked his ground at the edge of things and kept his own counsel, and Thomas watched him sometimes from across the creek and thought about what it cost to occupy that kind of space. the space at the furthest edge of the fire's warmth, where the light was thin and the cold came in from every direction that was not the fire. The farther a man stood from the center of the fire, the colder the gold rush became. Thomas understood this as a fact about heat and distance. He was beginning to understand it as a fact about something else as well. Something that did not have a clean name in the vocabulary available to him in the summer of 1849, but that was visible if you stood at your claim and looked at the creek from one end to the other, from the best ground to the worst, and asked yourself how the distribution had happened, and whether the answer you arrived at was one you were comfortable with. He was not entirely comfortable with it. He was also still standing upstream. He went back to work. The creek moved past him, taking with it whatever it carried. The gold and the sediment and the cold and the evidence of everything happening along its banks, downstream and away, and eventually to the sea, which did not sort any of it by who deserved what, which took everything and gave nothing back, which was, Thomas thought, as close to honest as water ever got. The line formed before Thomas saw where it was leading. He noticed it on his way back from the creek at 7 in the evening. A line of men moving with the particular purposeful shuffle of people who know where they are going and have decided it is worth waiting for. He followed the direction of it with his eyes and found the source at the south edge of camp, near the tree line, where a canvas shelter smaller than most of the sleeping tents had been set up sometime in the past week. He joined the line without knowing exactly why. This was, he would think later, the most honest thing he had done all day. The woman running the shelter was Chilean. He estimated her age at somewhere between 35 and 50, the range being uncertain because the California sun and the California work had a way of making precise age estimation unreliable. She had the bearing of someone conducting serious business, which she was, and the efficiency of movement of someone who had set up this particular operation before, which she probably had, because the operation was too well organized to be a first attempt. She was selling tamales. They cost 25 cents each. 25 cents was, by Thomas's accounting, a non-trivial sum in the context of the arithmetic he was managing. 25 cents was $0.25. He needed $600. 25 cents was not nothing. He paid it. He paid it and took the tamale and stepped out of the line to make room for the man behind him and ate it standing in the early dark with the sounds of the camp around him and the Sierra Nevada going dark blue against the sky to the east. For a few seconds, he remembered that food could be something other than fuel. The tamale was made from masa and filled with something that had been seasoned with actual spices, with the complexity of flavor that came from someone knowing what they were doing and caring about the result. It was hot. It had been made today, not days ago, not preserved or dried or salt cured or any of the other things that had been done to most of what Thomas had eaten in the past 7 weeks. Someone had made it today with their hands from ingredients they had sourced and prepared, and the making of it had included the kind of attention to the result that the daily production of camp food did not include. Thomas stood in the dark and ate it and did not think about anything for the 30 seconds it took to finish it. This was rarer than it sounds. For 7 weeks, there had been no moment of the day that was free of the arithmetic, the background calculation of dollars and days and distance that ran continuously whether he was working or eating or trying to sleep. The tamale interrupted it, not for long, but completely, for 30 seconds, in the way that something unexpected and genuinely good can interrupt even the most persistent preoccupation. There were very few women in the California gold camps. In 1849, in the mining districts specifically, the imbalance was extreme. The kind of demographic anomaly that did not occur in ordinary life and that produced conditions ordinary life did not produce. Some accounts described camps where women were entirely absent. As the rush developed and the settlements grew more permanent, women arrived in larger numbers. But the mining camps in the hills, the rougher and more temporary operations like this one, remained overwhelmingly male for most of this period. The women who were present occupied roles that the camp's economy had created space for. Laundry. A woman who could wash clothes in a camp of 200 men had a business that could generate more reliable income than most of the miners around her, because the demand was constant and the supply of competitors was almost non-existent. The prices charged for laundry in the California camps were a source of genuine astonishment for men who had arrived from places where laundry was simply a domestic task performed by the women of the household at no direct cost. Here it was a service with a market price, and the market price reflected scarcity. Food. The woman at the south edge of camp, with her tamale operation, was part of a pattern that repeated itself across the gold fields. Women cooking and selling food in environments where most men could not or would not cook for themselves with any real skill or attention. The meals produced by these operations were almost always better than the camp standard, and the premium charged for them was almost always paid, because men who had been eating beans and hardtack for 6 weeks would pay for something that tasted like it had been made by someone who cared. Boarding houses and tent hotels in the larger settlements along the routes to the camps were often run by women who had recognized the same basic economic opportunity that Bell had recognized, which was that men in transit with money were a reliable market for the services of someone willing to provide comfort and organization in exchange for payment. These women made money, in some cases, significantly more money than the men around them who were pulling gold from the ground. This fact was not widely discussed, because it disrupted a narrative about who the gold rush was for and who was doing the real work of it. But there was something else missing from the camps that was harder to quantify than women specifically. What was missing was not simply women. What was missing was ordinary life. Children and kitchens and neighbors who had known you for years, and Sunday clothes and family arguments, and the routines that gave days a shape beyond the shape of work. What was missing was the presence of people who knew who a man had been before California got to him, who had a prior version of him to compare to the current version and could tell him if the comparison was concerning. Mary knew who Thomas had been. His mother knew. His father, the people he had grown up among, who had watched him become whoever he was, and had opinions about whether he was doing it correctly. Here, no one had that version of him. He was only what he had been since May. Only the California version. And the California version was the only one available for anyone to assess. He wondered sometimes what that version looked like from the outside. He thought about Caleb Marsh, who had arrived here in May, the same week Thomas had, and who had been present for the same 7 weeks, and who had developed his own California version that Thomas watched from a distance and could not fully read. Caleb did not talk about anyone back home. Thomas did not know if there was someone, a wife, a mother, someone who held the prior version of Caleb, and would notice the difference when he returned. He did not know if Caleb was planning on returning. He did not ask. He walked back toward the center of camp where the main fires were going. Behind him, at the south edge, the line had diminished but had not disappeared. The woman in the canvas shelter was still working, still moving with the focused efficiency of someone running a successful operation in difficult conditions, doing what she had come here to do, which was the same thing Thomas had come here to do, which was to find in this remote and specific moment in time a way to make the numbers work in her favor. She was doing it better than most of the men around her. Thomas did not know her name. He knew the tamale had cost 25 cents and had been worth it. He filed this information in the place where he kept things that were true and that he did not have a full framework for yet. The place that had been getting fuller since he arrived in California. The place that he thought he would need to do something with eventually, when he had the time and the distance to do it properly. For now he had the rest of the evening. And the arithmetic, always the arithmetic. Thomas could name the river in English. The men beside him could name it in Spanish. The people who had known it longest had names for it that no one in this camp had bothered to learn, Thomas included. He thought about this on a night in late July when the camp had gone quieter than usual. A Tuesday that had produced less than average, and that everyone seemed to want to be done with. And he found himself standing at the edge of the firelight, looking out into the dark that the fire did not reach. The dark beyond a mining campfire was a specific kind of dark. It was not the dark of a city at night, which is never truly dark, because the city makes its own light, and the light escapes upward and sideways and fills the dark with a gray residue of itself. It was not even the dark of the Ohio countryside at night, which had the occasional lamp in a farmhouse window, the distant sound of a road, the sense of a human landscape that continued past where you could see it. This dark was older than any of that. The Sierra Nevada foothills at night in 1849, beyond the circle of a fire, was a dark that had been there before any of these men arrived, before the Spanish arrived, before the missions and the ranchos and the whole accumulated human project of turning this particular piece of the continent into something that answered to a name on a map. The dark held all of that before time in it, the way soil holds the organic record of everything that has lived in it and died and broken down and become part of the ground. Thomas stood at the edge of the light and looked into the dark and thought about what was out there. He knew, in the abstract way that a man knows things he has read or been told, that this land had been occupied for a very long time before any version of himself or anyone like him arrived. The people of the Miwok, the Maidu, the Nisina, and the other nations whose territory overlapped with what the American miners now called the gold fields, had lived in and around these hills and these creeks for generations beyond the range of the written record that Thomas had access to. They had names for the rivers, names for the mountains, names for the plants and the animals, and the seasonal movements of both. They had built systems of living in this landscape that had worked for longer than the United States of America had existed. He knew this. He had not thought about it much. The pace of the camp did not encourage thinking about it. The pace of the camp encouraged thinking about the immediate, the claim, the creek, the yield, the arithmetic. The horizon of a mining camp was very close by design, because the closer the horizon, the less there was to process, and the more energy remained for the work that the whole enterprise depended on. But standing at the edge of the firelight, on a quiet Tuesday in late July, with the dark pressing in from every direction that was not the fire, Thomas found himself thinking about it. There was a man he had seen several times in the past 2 weeks. He worked at the edge of the camp doing the heaviest and least specialized labor, carrying water, moving timber, doing the work that the camp's operation required, but that nobody with a viable alternative chose to do because it paid very little and led nowhere. He was Miwok. Thomas believed, though he had no certainty about this, and had not asked, and was not sure, the question was one he had the standing to ask or the language to ask properly. He had seen the man arrive in the morning and leave in the evening, and in between do work that Thomas would not have done for the rate it appeared he was being paid. And he had not spoken to him, and the man had not spoken to Thomas. And this non-conversation had repeated itself several times, without either of them doing anything to change it. Thomas thought about this at the edge of the fire. He thought about what it was like to carry water for men who were digging up a creek that had been part of your landscape before the concept of digging it for gold existed in anyone's mind. What he had was the outside, the observable facts of the situation. And the outside told him that the arrangement was not one he could look at, without noticing that it was arranged in a particular direction. That benefit moved one way, and labor moved another, and that the man carrying water was on the labor end of that arrangement, without having chosen it from among competing options. Between the middle of the 1840s and 1870, within a single generation, the native population of California would collapse from somewhere around 150,000 people to approximately 30,000. This number, when it is encountered in a history book, has the flat quality of a statistic, the quality of something that happened in the past at a scale too large for individual human experience to contain. It did not happen at a scale too large for individual human experience. It happened at the scale of specific people in specific places, losing specific things. The creek that was now Thomas's claim had been someone's creek before it was anyone's claim. The fish that had been in it, that were fewer now, because the mining had disturbed the conditions that the fish required, had been food before they were collateral damage. The oak trees at the edge of the camp, the ones that had been cut for timber and for firewood, without anyone asking who might have depended on the acorns they produced, had been a food source before they were building material. These were not abstractions. They were the specific contents of a life that had been displaced by the specific contents of the camp Thomas was standing in. And the displacement was not an accident, and not a tragedy in the sense of something that happened without human agency. It was the result of many human decisions, most of them made without any particular acknowledgement of what they were deciding. Thomas could name the river in English. He did not know what its name had been before that. He had been here for 7 weeks in the landscape that the river ran through, and had learned the English name of the river and the Spanish name, and had never thought to ask whether those were the only names it had ever had. He thought about it now. He thought about the man carrying water. One evening the previous week, Thomas had been walking back from the creek when the man passed him going in the opposite direction, carrying 2 full buckets on a wooden yoke across his shoulders. They had been close enough that Thomas could have spoken. He had opened his mouth and then closed it, because he did not have the words for what he wanted to say. which was something between an acknowledgement and an apology and a question. And not having the words felt like not having the right. And so he had said nothing, and walked on, and the man had walked on, and the distance between them had continued to be the same distance it had always been, measured in more than feet. He wrote it in his notebook that night, in the simplest language he had. There were people here before us. I do not know their names or their words for this river. I do not think anyone in this camp has asked. I did not ask either. He closed the notebook. He went to sleep in the way he always went to sleep in California, incompletely, with one part of himself still monitoring the tent and the camp and the sound of the creek that the people who had come before him had called something he would never know. The fire outside burned lower. The dark came in from the edges. The creek ran through all of it. The same water it had always been, carrying whatever it carried. The gold and the sediment and the cold and everything that the mountains were done with. Downstream and away. The way water moves everything, eventually, patient and without preference, toward the sea. The candle cost too much. Thomas set it in the neck of an empty bottle he had found at the edge of the camp, the closest thing to a candlestick available in his current inventory, and lit it with a match, and sat with the paper in front of him and the pencil in his hand and the small circle of light the candle threw against the canvas wall of the tent. James, Riordan, and Dutch were asleep. The camp outside was in its late phase. Most of the noise gone. Only the occasional sound from the direction of the saloon tent, where someone was apparently unwilling to let the evening end on whatever terms the evening had produced. Thomas looked at the paper. He had been putting this letter off for 4 days. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he knew too well what he wanted to say, and knew that what he wanted to say and what he could say were different things, separated by a distance that did not shorten, no matter how long he sat with the paper. He thought about what he wanted to write. I am tired. He held the pencil above the paper and thought about those 3 words and what they contained and what Mary would do with them if she received them. She would worry. The worry would be real and specific, and there would be nothing she could do about it from Licking County, Ohio, which meant the worry would sit in her without anywhere to go, which meant that sending the words was adding to the total amount of suffering in the world without adding anything to the total amount of understanding. He did not write them. I miss William. He thought about writing this, about what it meant to miss someone you had never met. Whether that was the right word for it or whether missing required a prior presence to miss from. He had a version of William in his mind, built from Mary's letters, from the descriptions she had sent him. Brown hair and loud when he wants something, and looks like you round the eyes. And he had been adding to this version over weeks from the outside, from inference and from the occasional detail in a letter that arrived weeks after it was sent. The information always describing a William who was younger than the William who existed at the moment of reading. He was missing a person he had assembled from words. He did not know if that was missing or something else. He did not write it. I do not know if I can do this. He thought about this one for a long time. It was the truest thing he could put on the paper. It was the thought that visited him most consistently in the hours when the camp was quiet and the arithmetic was running, and the distance between where he was and where he needed to be showed itself clearly. He did not know. 47 days in, and he genuinely did not know if the path he had chosen was going to arrive anywhere. He thought about what Mary would do with those words. She would be afraid. Not in an abstract way. In the specific way of a woman who has a child 4 months old, and a mortgage on the farm, and a husband in California who has just written to say he does not know if he can do what he went there to do. The fear would be real, and the information she could act on would be minimal, and the interval before his next letter would be long, and the interval before he could actually do anything in response to her fear would be longer. He did not write it. What he wrote was this: I am well. The work is hard, but I am making progress. I expect to have good news soon. He sat back and read what he had written. Every sentence was true in the way that things are true when they are constructed carefully enough. He was well in the sense that he was functional, that his body was continuing to perform the work required of it, that he had not been injured or seriously ill. The work was hard, which was accurate beyond argument. He was making progress, which was true in the mathematical sense that his total accumulated gold was larger than it had been a week ago. Even if the rate of accumulation relative to the distance remaining was something he was choosing not to put in the letter. He expected to have good news soon, which was true in the sense that he expected it, that he maintained the expectation as a working hypothesis, because the alternative to maintaining it was too heavy to carry. He read it again. Each sentence had been constructed to be true in the most limited and technical sense while conveying, in the aggregate, a picture of his situation that bore only a passing relationship to what it actually felt like to be sitting in a tent in the California foothills at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with a candle he had paid too much for and a pencil, and 47 days of insufficient progress between him and the thing he had come here to do. The letter did not lie because Thomas was dishonest. It lied because distance made honesty useless. What would the honest version accomplish? It would arrive in Ohio in 6 weeks, after passing through San Francisco and a series of postal transfers that were themselves unreliable in this period. And when it arrived, it would make Mary afraid in a way that she could not act on and that Thomas could not respond to for another 6 weeks after that. The honest version would put his fear and his doubt into the hands of someone who loved him and could do nothing with it except carry it. And adding to the weight Mary was already carrying was not something Thomas could justify on the grounds of his own need for honesty. He needed to be honest somewhere. He was honest in his notebook. In the notebook he wrote the actual numbers and the actual feelings and the actual texture of the days, not for anyone else, but for himself. Because keeping a completely false account of his own experience seemed like a kind of self-harm that he was not willing to perform, even in service of protecting the people he loved from worry. The notebook stayed in California. The letter went to Ohio. He addressed it in the careful hand he had developed from his mother's insistence on legible correspondence. Mary Ward, Licking County, Ohio. He folded it and sealed it and set it next to the candle to take to the postal arrangement in the morning. The candle was burning down. He sat with the letter beside him and thought about Mary reading it in the house in Ohio. In the kitchen, probably, because Mary read letters in the kitchen, standing at the counter where the light from the window was good in the morning. She would read it twice. She would look for what was not in it the way she looked for things. Quietly, and without announcing what she was doing, she would find the spaces. She was smart enough to find the spaces. To know that I am well, and the work is hard, but I am making progress, covered a landscape of experience that those words did not actually describe. and she would fill the spaces with her own version of what was happening. And her version might be more accurate than what he had written, and might be less accurate, and he had no way to know which, because the distance between them was measured in weeks of postal transit and not in anything that moved faster. He blew out the candle before it burned all the way down. Wasted candle was wasted money, and wasted money was more time in California. He sat in the dark for a moment after the light went out. The darkness complete, and the camp quiet around him, and the creek running outside, and the letter on the ground beside him, sealed and addressed, and waiting to make its slow way east. He thought about Mary's face in the kitchen, reading. He thought about her finding the spaces. He thought about whether the version of him she was constructing from these letters was close to the version of him that existed in this tent. And whether, if he ever got back to Ohio, those two versions would match up well enough that she would recognize him. He lay down on his bedroll. He was tired in ways the letter had not mentioned. The creek ran outside. He closed his eyes and let the dark take him. Thomas woke at 2 in the morning for no reason he could identify. Not a sound, not a movement in the tent, not the cough from Prescott's tent that had become part of the nightly texture of the camp. Just the ordinary middle-of-the-night waking that happened sometimes when the body had processed its first round of sleep and was deciding whether to commit to a second one. He lay in the dark and listened. The saloon tent had gone quiet. The gambling operation had folded. The camp was in its deepest phase, the phase it reached only in the hours between 1 and 4, when even the men who resisted sleep had been overcome by it. And the sounds were the sounds of the camp's biology rather than its social life. Breathing, the occasional shift of a body on the ground, the wind moving through the tent canvas, the creek, always the creek, running through every hour of every night with the same indifference to what was happening on the banks. And then, from the direction of Caleb Marsh's tent, a sound that Thomas's sleeping mind had perhaps registered before his waking mind caught up with it. Not a distress sound, not an alarm of any kind, something quieter and more deliberate than that. The sound of careful movement, the sound of someone doing something in a specific order, methodically, with attention to not making more noise than necessary. Thomas lay still and listened. He had known Caleb Marsh since May. 12 weeks of living in adjacent sections of the same camp, eating from the same cooking fire, working claims on the same stretch of creek, attending the same miners' meetings and standing at the same fires in the evenings. He did not know Caleb in the way you know people you have chosen over time and at leisure. He knew him the way you know people you have been thrown against by circumstance, which was to say, he knew the surface of him well, and the interior of him not at all. What he knew of the surface, Caleb worked consistently and without visible enthusiasm, which was the mode of most men in the camp, but which had a particular quality in Caleb, a steadiness that was less about contentment than about will. He ate what was available and did not complain about it. He had lost weight since May in a way that had changed the structure of his face, sharpened the angle, made him look older than 31 in the specific way that California was making all of them look older than they were. He spoke when there was something worth saying and was quiet the rest of the time, which in Thomas's experience was either the sign of a man who had thought carefully about the value of speech or the sign of a man who had run out of things he wanted to say. Thomas had not been able to determine which it was. He had seen Caleb at the gambling table 2 weeks ago, not as a man chasing excitement, but as a man running a different kind of arithmetic. The arithmetic of whether the numbers could be forced to change in a single evening. He had seen Caleb lose and reach for more coins and lose again, and he had watched the expression on Caleb's face, which was not desperation but something more controlled than that. The face of someone executing a plan they already knew might not work, but could not stop executing. Thomas had left before seeing how it ended. He had not asked about it in the days since. He lay in his bedroll now and listened to the careful sounds from Caleb's tent and understood, before his conscious mind had worked through the reasoning, what he was listening to. He got up. He did not put on his boots. He moved to the tent flap in his socks and opened it slowly and stood in the cold night air and looked toward Caleb's tent. The tent flap was open. The light inside was the dim, careful light of a candle cupped behind something, shielded so that it did the work it needed to do without broadcasting itself. Thomas could see the shadow of Caleb moving against the inner wall of the canvas, the shadow doing what the sounds had suggested, folding and stacking and organizing. He was packing, not the hasty packing of a man responding to an emergency. The deliberate packing of a man who had decided something and was now executing the decision with the same methodical quality he brought to everything. Each item placed rather than thrown. The bedroll rolled with the efficiency of someone who had rolled it many times and knew the sequence. The tools arranged in their carrying configuration. The configuration of travel rather than of camp. Thomas stood outside his tent in his socks in the 2 o'clock cold and watched Caleb's shadow prepare to leave. He thought about going over. He thought about what he would say if he went over. What words were available for this moment? Whether any of the words available were adequate to what the moment contained. Caleb had been here since May. Caleb had worked the same creek and eaten the same beans and attended the same meetings and stood at the same fires. Caleb had been part of the texture of this camp in the way that anyone you see every day becomes part of the texture of the environment. Not always noticed, but always present. A reference point for the normal, and now Caleb had decided. Thomas understood the deciding without having been party to it. Understood it the way you understand things that have been building in the periphery of your attention for a long time, and that resolve suddenly into clarity. Caleb had been coming to this decision for weeks. The gambling table had been part of it. The thinness of his face had been part of it. The particular quality of his silence in the evenings had been part of it. He had run the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had come out in a direction that Thomas could see from here and that Caleb had apparently been looking at for longer. Thomas did not go over. He stood at the edge of his own tent and watched the shadow move and thought about what it cost Caleb to make this decision, and what it cost him to execute it quietly, in the dark, before the camp was awake, so that the leaving did not require him to stand in front of anyone and explain or justify or receive the particular kind of attention that a man gets when he is seen to be quitting something that other men are continuing. The leaving in the dark was a mercy Caleb was granting himself. Thomas understood this too. After about 20 minutes, the shadow in Caleb's tent went still. Then the candle went out. A minute passed in which nothing happened. Then the tent flap opened, and Caleb came out into the 2 o'clock dark with his pack on his back and his tools in the configuration of travel, and his hat pulled down against the cold. He saw Thomas immediately. They looked at each other across the few feet of ground between the tents. In the dark, without speaking. The look contained what the situation contained, which was more than either of them had language. For at 2 in the morning in the California foothills, after 12 weeks of an enterprise that had not resolved the way either of them had needed it to resolve, Thomas did not say anything. Caleb did not say anything. After a moment, Caleb nodded once. The nod of a man acknowledging that he has been seen, and that the seeing is acceptable to him. Thomas nodded back. Caleb turned and walked toward the edge of the camp, moving with the quiet sureness of someone who had thought about this walk long enough to know every step of it in advance. He did not look back. He moved through the camp and past the cold cooking fire, and past the closed flap of the saloon tent, and past the stakes of the claims along the creek. And then he was past the edge of the firelight, and into the dark beyond it. And then he was gone. Thomas stood in his socks in the cold for another minute after Caleb disappeared. He thought about something that had arrived in his mind in the moment of watching Caleb walk away. A thought that he had not had before, in quite this form, that had assembled itself from the parts available to it while he stood there in the 2 o'clock dark. Leaving was not the opposite of courage. Sometimes leaving was the first honest thing a man did after a long time of telling himself the story he needed to stay. He thought about this. He thought about the story he had been telling himself for 12 weeks. The story in which the arithmetic would eventually work, in which the creek would yield what he needed it to yield, in which the distance between where he was and $600 would close through the accumulation of days and work and the occasional better-than-average result. The story was not a lie. It was possible. It remained possible. But Caleb had been telling a version of the same story, and at some point the story had stopped being enough for Caleb to keep paying the price of it. Thomas did not know when that point was for himself. He did not know if he had passed it without recognizing it, or if it was still ahead of him, or if it was the kind of thing you could know in advance or only in retrospect. Standing somewhere else, looking back at this night and this creek and this tent, he was not leaving tonight. He was not leaving because of Mary and because of William and because of the mortgage on the farm in Licking County and because $600 remained, $600 regardless of what happened to Caleb, and because he had come too far and spent too much to turn back on a night when nothing particular had changed, except that the man in the next tent had made a different calculation than Thomas was prepared to make. He went back into his tent. He lay on his bedroll in the dark. From Caleb's tent, nothing, no sound, no shadow. The tent stood empty now, the flap still open, the interior dark and no longer inhabited. By morning someone would notice, and by afternoon someone would probably move into it. Because space in a mining camp was a resource, and empty space did not stay empty long. By tomorrow night, Caleb Marsh would not be a presence in this camp in any way that the camp would register. His claim would be available. His spot at the cooking fire would be filled by whoever stood closest. His name would come up once or twice in conversation, and then less, and then not at all as the days accumulated, and the camp moved forward in the way that camps move forward. Continuously, and without much ceremony for what it leaves behind. Thomas lay in the dark and thought about Caleb walking south in the 2 o'clock dark with his pack and his tools. He thought about what Caleb was walking toward. He thought about what he himself was staying for. He thought about Mary reading the letter he had written tonight, finding the spaces between the sentences. constructing her version of what was happening here. The creek ran outside. Day 48 was already in progress by the clock. Though the light would not arrive for 2 more hours, and the work would not start until the light came, Thomas did not sleep again. He lay in the dark and waited for the morning, with the particular alertness of a man who has watched something he recognized happen to someone else and is still determining what it means for himself. Turning it over in the dark, the way you turn over something real. Looking for its actual shape. $600. He was still here. He was still here. The placer gold ran out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Not all at once. Not in a single season. But the pattern was visible to anyone paying attention by the early 1850s. The yields declining in the established camps as the easily accessible deposits were worked through. The men who had come first, taking the richest ground, and the men who came after finding diminishing returns on the same methods in the same creeks. What replaced the individual miner with his pan was capital. Companies formed. Investors in San Francisco and Sacramento, and eventually in the eastern cities, pooled money to fund operations that could do what individual men could not do. That could move rivers out of their channels to expose the bedrock beneath. That could dig shafts into the mountains and bring out the gold that was locked in quartz, rather than flowing free in gravel. The scale of the enterprise changed. And as the scale changed, the nature of the men doing it changed too. The 49er with his pan gave way to the wage laborer working for a company, trading the uncertain freedom of working for himself for the reliable structure of working for someone else. Hydraulic mining came later and changed the landscape in ways that took generations to reckon with. Water under enormous pressure directed at hillsides, dissolving them into slurries, processing entire mountains for the gold locked inside. The efficiency was remarkable. The destruction was equally remarkable. And the rivers downstream from the hydraulic operations ran thick with sediment that buried farmland and choked the valleys, and produced legal battles that would eventually result in the first major environmental court ruling in American history. This night still belongs to pans and tired hands. The future that was coming for California, the industrial future of companies and capital and machinery, powerful enough to tear hillsides apart, is not here yet on the American river in the summer of 1849. Here, the scale is still human. Here it is still men in creeks with tools they can carry, working ground they can understand, producing results they can hold in the palm of a hand. California became a state in September of 1850. Just over a year from this night. The formal institutions that the camps had improvised around, the courts and the sheriffs and the legal machinery of property and contract, began to arrive and fill in the spaces where miners' meetings had been doing the work of governance. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 brought the social pressure that already existed in the camps into the domain of law, formalizing what had been practiced informally and accelerating the departure of the Sonoran miners whose knowledge and skill had shaped the techniques the entire industry depended on. San Francisco grew into a real city on the momentum the rush had generated. The commercial infrastructure of the gold fields, expanding and diversifying and eventually outlasting the gold fields themselves. The men who had positioned themselves in the supply chain rather than in the creeks, the Bells and the Brannans, found that the economy they had helped build kept generating returns long after the easy gold was gone. The legend of the gold rush began to form while the gold rush was still happening. This is the part that mattered most for what came after. Because a legend that forms in real time is not built from evidence. It is built from what people need to believe about what is happening, shaped by the distance between the thing and the person describing it, amplified by repetition and by the human tendency to make the stories we tell each other better than the stories we lived. The newspapers in the eastern cities needed a story about opportunity and freedom and the possibility of reinvention. Because that story sold papers, and because that story was what people wanted to believe about a country that was still deciding what it was. The man with the pan against the California sky, free and self-determining, master of his own fate in the open country of the West, was exactly the image that served that need. What the image left out was also real. It left out the beans and the wet boots and the arithmetic that did not close. It left out Bell's ledger and the gambling tent and the whole system that had been built to move gold from the hands of the men who found it into the hands of the men who were positioned to receive it. It left out the downstream section of the creek, where Rodrigo worked the inferior ground with techniques he had brought from Sonora and that the upstream miners had absorbed without acknowledgement. It left out the Chilean man who walked out of Coloma in the dark. It left out the Miwok man carrying water for people who had not asked what the source was called. It left out Caleb Marsh walking south before dawn with his pack and his tools, and the particular weight of a decision made honestly after a long time of making it dishonestly. It left out Thomas Ward standing in his socks in the 2 o'clock cold, watching a man he knew disappear into the dark beyond the firelight, trying to understand what the watching meant for himself. The poster was cleaner than any of that. The poster was clean and bright and asked nothing of the person looking at it except to believe that the man in it was free, and that the freedom was available, and that California was a place where the distance between what you needed and what the ground would give you was smaller than it was everywhere else. The ground knew something different. The ground held the record of what had actually happened on it, in the marks left by tools and boots, and the redirection of water and the removal of material, the physical evidence of an enormous human effort conducted over years in a landscape that had not been designed to receive it. The ground would go on holding that record long after the camps were gone and the creeks had returned to something closer to what they had been before. Patient and permanent in the way of things that have no reason to be in a hurry. The gold the mountains released into the water had been there for millions of years before any of this started. Most of it is still there. The boots were still wet. This was where we started, and this is where we return. Because the boots being wet was not a detail. It was the whole of it. It was the thing that did not change regardless of what the night had contained, regardless of what had been thought or felt or written or watched or decided or left undecided in the hours between sunset and 4 in the morning. The boots were wet because the creek was cold, and the nights were not long enough for wet boots to dry, and the mornings came whether or not anything had been resolved. Thomas sat on the edge of his bedroll in the dark of the tent. James Riordan was breathing steadily to his left, the breathing of a man in deep and untroubled sleep, the kind of sleep that Thomas had not achieved in several weeks and that he had stopped resenting because resentment required energy he did not have to spare. Dutch was a shape in the dark to his right, equally still. He dressed in the order he always dressed: buns, shirt, boots. He tied the boots with the automatic efficiency of 48 mornings of doing it the same way. The knot exactly as tight as it needed to be. He had learned early that too tight a boot at 4 in the morning meant a problem at noon that could not be addressed until the day's work was done. He stepped outside. The camp in the hour before dawn was not silent. It was in a specific kind of quiet that was different from silence. A quiet that had texture and depth, that was made up of layers of sound operating below the threshold of what the ear sorted as noteworthy. The creak, lowest and most constant. Underneath everything. The movement of air through the timber on the hillside above camp. A sound that changed with the direction of the wind, and that Thomas had learned to read for weather the way you learn to read any repeated signal. The occasional shift and settle of a tent under its guy ropes. The breathing of 200 men in the tents around him. Not individually audible, but collectively present. A low biological hum that was the sound of the camp, alive and unaware of itself. From Caleb's tent, nothing. Thomas looked at the empty tent as he passed it on his way to the cooking fire. The flap was still open from the night, hanging loose, moving slightly in the pre-dawn air. The interior was dark and still, and held none of the evidence of habitation, none of the small signs that distinguish a lived-in space from an empty one. Caleb had been thorough. By noon, someone would probably be in it. Thomas continued to the cooking fire. He was not the first one there. Wallace, who ran the central cooking area, and who was the closest thing the camp had to a professional cook, was already at the fire, doing what Wallace did every morning, which was produce coffee from materials and conditions that did not favor the production of good coffee, and that Wallace had, through repetition and stubbornness, bent to his purposes anyway. The fire was low but steady. The pot was on. The smell of it reached Thomas before he was close enough to speak. And the smell was as it was every morning. The best part of the next 10 minutes, Wallace handed him a cup without being asked. Thomas drank it, standing, because sitting down at 4 in the morning sent a signal to his body that he was not prepared to send. Other men came in ones and twos to the fire in the way they came every morning. The same general procession, in the same general order. The early risers first, and then the others, as the darkness lightened toward gray, and the gray lightened toward the first suggestion of color above the eastern ridge. They drank their coffee and ate what Wallace had. Biscuits, harder than anyone would have accepted in the life they had come from. And they did not talk much, because talking at 4 in the morning required a kind of energy that the morning had not yet provided. Thomas looked at the faces around the fire. 48 days of looking at these faces had produced a familiarity that was not intimacy, but was its own thing. A recognition that went deeper than names and shallower than understanding. He knew these faces the way you know the faces of people you have survived something alongside. Which is to say, you knew them in the specific dimension of the surviving, and not necessarily in the dimensions that existed before or would exist after. Prescott was at the fire. He was thinner than he had been 2 weeks ago. And the cough that Thomas had been listening to through the canvas wall for 6 nights was present even here. Even standing upright in the morning, cold, with a cup of coffee in both hands. It was the same cough Thomas had noticed changing, going lower and wetter. The cough of a chest that was dealing with something more serious than damp nights and cold water. Prescott held his cup with the focused attention of a man for whom the warmth of it was doing medical work. He had not been to see Ho. Thomas knew this because he would have heard about it, and he had heard nothing. Thomas looked at him and thought about saying something. He thought about it for the length of time it took to drink half his coffee, standing 3 feet away from a man he had listened to cough for 6 nights and had said nothing to about it. The camp's rule was clear: a man's body was his own business until he chose to make it someone else's. Thomas had followed this rule without examining it, because following it was easier than examining it. He looked at Prescott and said, quietly, that Holt was usually at his tent before the light came up. If Prescott had anything that needed looking at, Prescott did not respond immediately. He held his coffee cup and looked at the fire. Then he said he would think about it. Thomas nodded and did not push further. It was the most either of them could do within the rules they both lived under. And it was more than Thomas had done in 6 nights of listening. And he filed that fact in the place where he kept things he was not going to be comfortable with for a while. Rodrigo, the Sonoran miner from the Downstream section, was at the edge of the fire group, as he sometimes was in the mornings. Close enough to share the warmth, but slightly separate from the main cluster of men, in the way that had become natural over weeks, without anyone designing it or discussing it. He held his cup with the same 2 hands as Prescott, and looked at the fire with the expression of a man doing the same arithmetic as everyone else. Thomas looked at him and thought about the stakes dispute and the miners' meeting and the unspoken logic of upstream and downstream. And he thought about the adjustment to his technique 3 weeks ago, and the daily yield that had improved since then, and the name he had never said in the conversations at the fire. He finished his coffee. He handed the cup back to Wallace. He picked up his tools. He walked to his claim. The creek in the hour before full light was a different thing from the creek at noon. In the pre-dawn, the water caught what little light there was and held it in the way. Moving water holds light, not as reflection exactly, but as a quality of the surface, something alive and variable that the noon sun would flatten into glare. Thomas stood at the edge of the bank and looked at the water and thought about 48 days of standing here and what he had learned about this specific creek, this specific stretch of it, the way the current moved over the particular shape of the bottom here, and what that movement meant for where the heavy material settled. He had learned this creek. He had learned it the way you learn something you cannot leave, by being with it every day regardless of what it produced, building up, over time, a knowledge that was more than the sum of its observations, a knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes and the feet on the bank, the kind of knowledge that could not be transferred in words because it was not stored in words. He stepped into the water. The cold took his breath the way it always took his breath. The same shock at the same temperature after 48 mornings, the body not adapting to it so much as learning to withstand it, learning to complete the step into the water without retreating, to absorb the shock and keep moving. The pan went in. He worked. Above the eastern ridge, the light was building in the way it built in the Sierra Nevada foothills in late July and early August. Not gradually, but in steps, the dark going to gray, and the gray going to the first pale quality of light that was not quite color yet, and then the color arriving, the blue of the sky appearing as if declared rather than developed, the ridgeline going from black to detail to the specific gold and brown of rock and timber that it was in full light. By the time the light was full, Thomas had been working for an hour. He had not been thinking about anything in particular. He had been working, which was its own form of thought. A form that operated without language, that processed the creek and the pan and the sediment and the occasional color with the part of the mind that did not need to narrate what it was doing. Around him, the camp was waking. The sounds of it came up from behind him. The sounds of 200 men beginning another day of the same enterprise. The coughing and the first voices and the specific percussion of tools being taken from their resting places and deployed in the direction of the creek. Day 48 was in operation. He did not look up. He worked the pan through the cycle he had worked it through 47 times before. The swirl and the wash and the assessment of what remained. And what remained this morning was what remained most mornings. Sediment and gravel and the patient hope of a man who had committed to a position and was not yet ready to revise it. He thought about Caleb walking south in the dark. He thought about William in Ohio, 4 months old and growing, and about a face he could only partially construct from the description in a letter. Brown hair and loud when he wants something and looks like you around the eyes. And about the fact that by the time he got back to Ohio, that face would be different from any version he was currently imagining. He thought about Mary finding the spaces in the letter. He thought about the man whose name he did not know carrying water for people who had not asked what the river was called. He thought about Prescott at the fire, holding his coffee with both hands, saying he would think about it. None of the thinking resolved into anything clean or complete. And the creek moved past him, taking whatever it carried, and the light came up over the ridge, and the day began in earnest around him. The pan came up. He looked at what was in it. Small color. Not much. Enough to log. Not enough to change anything. He bent and put the pan back in the water and started again. This was not a story about a man who found what he was looking for in the way he was looking for it. It was a story about what a man found instead, about what the creek gave, and what the creek kept, and what the nights between the days contained that the days did not, about what it cost to be part of this particular moment in this particular place, and who paid which parts of that cost, and whether the men doing the paying understood what they were paying for. Most of them did not understand it fully. Most of them understood the surface of it, the arithmetic of gold and days, and the distance from home, the deeper cost, the cost in the body and in the parts of a man that were not in the ledger, the cost to the people who had been in this landscape before any of this started, the cost of the choices made and not made, and the silences kept at moments when speaking would have been harder and more honest than not speaking. That cost was being paid in currency that did not get counted, but the currency was real, and the paying was happening, and the ground recorded it the way the ground records everything, patiently and without judgment, absorbing the evidence of what passed over it and holding it in the way of things that have no reason to let go. Thomas Ward worked his claim on the American River on the 48th day of his time in California. Around him, 200 men worked their claims in the camps strung out along the American River and the Feather River and the Yuba and the Trinity and the dozens of creeks and drainages feeding them. Tens of thousands of men were doing the same thing at the same hour on the same morning, bending their backs to the same work, performing the same calculation between what they had and what they needed, carrying the same weight of distance and hope and the particular exhaustion that came from both. Day 48, Day 91, Day 152. The number was different for each man, and the arithmetic was different, and the name waiting in the letter back home was different. But the shape of it was the same. A man with a pan in a cold creek at dawn. The light coming up over the ridge. The camp coming awake behind him. The day beginning in the only way it knew how to begin. Without ceremony, without promise, without anything except the creek and the pan and the small cold hope of something heavy settling at the bottom when the water clears. Thomas did not begin again because he believed today would save him. He began again because stopping would require a kind of courage he had not yet found. The light came fully over the ridge. The camp filled with the sounds of its own waking. The creek moved past Thomas, and past the claims, and past the camp, and down through the foothill country, and out into the valley, and toward the sea, carrying whatever the mountains released into it. The gold and the sediment and the cold and the record of everything that had happened on its banks, moving it downstream, the way water moves everything, patient and without preference, toward wherever water goes, when it is done with where it has been. The gold rush promised men that gold could buy back their future. Many discovered, too late, that the future was exactly what they were spending. The ground was there before the poster. The ground would be there after. Thomas put his pan in the water. Day 48. The creek did not care. The creek ran.